Okay, boys, it's finally time to jump right in to the details, the meat of what Trueskill actually is. Because as we went over in the video on Riot, obviously like changing the way that ranked works drastically without really telling anybody, what we ended up discovering from a few comments from some rioters was that League had switched some point in the distant past probably to using their own version of MMR that was quite different from the initial ELO system and then the initial MMR system, that we're familiar with from chess or that League had in early seasons. And I guess a bit naively, because I wanted the latter to be super straightforward and easy for people to understand. I had always conceptualized the latter as what it was in season one and season two, where you could see your MMR. And so I always thought that behind the scenes, it was just the same thing. They were just encouraging people with pretty, and easy to understand ranks. And that essentially it worked like an ELO system in chess, where based on winning or losing games at a certain ELO, you go up a little bit. And really the only differences were that, you have some differences in matchmaking compared to an ELO system to account for duoing, to account for blue side, red side, like the red side team having a little bit higher MMR. And then, of course, your gains and losses, and this is true even in the ELO system, are a little bit larger if you're winning against a better opponent or in League, a better average team. And if you're losing against a team that is worse than you, you would lose more as well. And then on the flip side of that, if your team was favored to lose, or you're supposed to lose, and the other team was higher MMR than you, you wouldn't lose as much, etc. So that was what I thought was going on. And obviously, it sounds like they're using a skill-based matchmaking system that takes more than just wins and losses into account, which is pretty shocking because obviously there's a lot of implications to, well, if you're using something other than wins or losses potentially in League to determine the outcome of people climbing, there's a lot of questions that can fly there because Riot's never going to tell people what metrics they're using to judge people's skill. And if they're not telling us the metrics that they use, there's actually no way to prove or disprove that the rank system is fair and balanced. And this is coming from, a player who does believe that the matchmaking system is skill based. I hit GM a couple of times. I was 5 games away from Challenger last split. As a high elo player, of course, I desperately want to believe that the rank system makes sense. And I think that there's evidence that it does. I mean, I can consistently move to different houses, different IP addresses, different computers, over the years. And I'm still able to consistently climb no matter what account I'm playing on, no matter what the state of the account. So I'm sure that it is a skill-based matchmaking system, not some kind of engagement-optimized matchmaking system, because if it was just engagement-based, you would see some weird discrepancies of players not being able to climb back to their main rank. But since players can consistently climb back to their main rank, and usually in short order, I would definitely say that it's a skill-based matchmaking system. The problem is, and we discussed this last time, I think that a skill-based matchmaking system should be transparent and straightforward and as simple as possible, even if that comes at the cost of a little bit of efficiency in how good the system is or how fast it is at placing people in the right rank. Because the more transparent you can be about it, the more the competitive integrity of the game in the eyes of the players and especially in the eyes of players who don't understand it all that well can be more assured. So we're going to jump into the actual papers this time and try to make some sense of it. They're long. We're going to read through the whole thing. I thought about skimming it, but since this is supposed to be an in-depth video on it anyways, we'll just do our best to read through it. I've got to be honest, I've taken high-level math classes before, statistics. I studied economics, have my bachelor's in economics. So I've, taken statistics. I had a 4.0 in Calc 3. This doesn't really use much calculus, though, or anything like that. I don't think almost any calculus. But there's a lot of Greek letters related to statistics and symbols and things like that I got to be honest with you, even with my understanding of math and a couple of years removed from college now, I can't tell you what a lot of these things mean. So we're going to try to do our best to read through it. Know, though, that you're not going to learn, through reading the equation, some crazy information about what metrics it's using, or anything like that, at least as far as I know going into this. I've read actually through the first paper, but I haven't read through the second paper. Second paper is probably going to be more interesting because the first paper, from what I've read and from what I understand, does just use wins and losses. And so that's what we had been using for a long time. And of course, the Rioter did say that just because they're using Trueskill 2 doesn't mean they have to use other metrics besides wins and losses. But I'm convinced that they are at this point, based on my personal experience. As I said, with the account I played with my wife on, there's no reason why those accounts should be a rank and a half apart from each other when we played every single ranked game together and every single normal game, except for like 2 or 3 normal games. The MMR that you would gain, even if you played extremely well and won all 3 normal games that I ended up playing without her on those accounts, could not possibly increase your ranked MMR by a rank and a half. So those accounts should serve as proof to anyone with a logical, skeptical brain that they're using more than win and loss to determine ranked. You're probably not going to be able to game the system, as I've said before, because at the end of the day, so if you're watching this hoping to find like a nugget in this, very long video, if you're watching this trying to find some, skill that you can exploit, or metric to focus on in order to exploit the rank system, it's probably not going to be in here. I would assume 99% chance that it's not going to be in here. Because ultimately, if you abuse the system and got higher than you were supposed to be, by, let's say, having a really high KDA, and so that boosts your MMR and you get to a higher rank, well, what would happen is you'd get to that higher rank and then you'd start playing against better players, better than you're able to handle. They make it more difficult for you to have such a good KDA, and it becomes more difficult for you to win the game. And of course, win and loss is still going to be the main metric that Riot uses in order to determine, what people's rank should be. And so, once you play a bunch of games at that rank and start losing more than you're winning, you will end up demoting anyways. So obviously, the goal of this Trueskill implementation is really about the first like 20, 30, 40, 50 games a player plays, where you don't have enough data using wins and losses alone to accurately and quickly get a player to a rank where they're winning 50% of their games. And that's something that Riot really cares about, because a lot of players don't play that much ranked, and or let's say they're a Smurf account and they don't play much ranked on that account. It's very important to Riot that they're able to quickly, or as quickly and efficiently as possible, put those accounts in the rank that they belong. And on the flip side, if you're a newer player, Riot wants to make sure that they put you in the rank that you belong, where you're winning 50% of your games. Because if they put you in a rank that's too good and you're only winning 30% of your games, you're not going to have a fun time and you're going to end up quitting the game. So, you do look at a game like Age of Empires 2, for example. I don't know how Age of Empires 4 works since that's out now, but, so people play Age of Empires 2, and it has a very straightforward ELO system like chess, where you see your ELO rating. But like in chess, if you've ever started playing chess on one of these websites, you just start at 1200 ELO, and you essentially have to lose a lot of games in a row to get to your appropriate rank, because there's no speeding up the process. There's no placement or anything like that. It's just everyone starts at 1200 ELO, and then you lose most of your games until you're down to like really low. So if, depending on how bad of a player you are, like for example, in Age of Empires, when I first started and I was playing with a friend and stuff like that, we dropped, I think, from 1200 to like 700 elo. And then that's about where we floored out, was about 700. And then we started climbing from there. And so that's a very painful process, because for a new player who's maybe not committed to the game yet, still deciding whether they even want to play ranked in League, maybe it's their first time playing ranked. A lot of those people, if they got into a rank that was too high, would just quit the game after they lose a bunch of games. And then on the opposite end, for all the players who are placed too low, mostly Smurf accounts, but even new players could get placed too low. If you inaccurately place somebody too low, you're going to ruin those games for the other players in them, because now there are these games that are like less in the control of those players, because they're less 50-50 for that rank, and more like this one guy on the other team is like giving his team a 70% chance of winning. And so that's not balanced either. And so it is in Riot's best interest to do this. Now, of course, we've talked about just ban smurfing. Dota did it, which I didn't know about because I'm not somebody who follows Dota a lot. But, if there's one thing I've learned from YouTube, people will let you know if you're wrong in the comments, or if there's some other information you should know. People are great at providing information really quickly. So, we found out that Dota has banned smurfing, and it's been extremely successful. So here's some things that they learned from that I would also recommend that high elo players consider. If we ban smurfing, high elo players may feel that sucks because I go on a Smurf account to practice other champions, or I go on a Smurf account to learn a new role and things like that. And I think that there are some counter arguments to these things that could be really good. First off, Riot could ban smurfing, but allow you to have a rank for each role that you play. And this is something that they've talked about in the past. That would allow you to have 5 roles with 5 different ranks on your main account, so that you can use your main account in order to play 5 different roles. This would get rid of probably the main reason why there are so many Smurf accounts in League in the first place. So Riot could do something like that. The other thing that is interesting is actually, if we ban smurfing, it will help high elo, because rather than all the high elo players spending all their time playing on Smurf accounts and like camping the decay games on their main account, people who are in Masters Plus are actually going to be forced to play the game, which does a lot, right? It creates a more competitive ladder, it creates better matchmaking, and it reduces the likelihood that people in high elo are auto-filled, because there are just way more players actually queuing up. So imagine if a high elo player averages like, I don't know, 3-4 games a day. Maybe it's more, maybe it's less. It depends on the person. I'm pretty old and washed, and so I probably average like 3 games a day, if that, across my accounts. A lot of people, right, still in their prime, still in school and stuff like that, maybe you're getting in 10 games a day, maybe even more. So look, these players in high elo who are playing that many games, imagine if 50%, 60%, 70% of these games are actually happening on lower elo Smurf accounts, because high elo players don't want to try to learn a new role or to learn a new champion on their main account. Now all of a sudden, imagine if smurfing is banned, and all of a sudden there are 70% more people queuing up for solo queue in high elo. That's going to be gigantic, because it's going to mean way higher quality matches. So anyways, let's get into the paper before I fall asleep. Okay, so Trueskill. So keep in mind, just a brief recap again. I know we got to get into the paper. Trueskill, or Trueskill 1, was the original system that Microsoft was developing. And then Trueskill 2 is the system that Riot is going to implement by the end of 2024, Season 14. So we're nearing that now, and it may already be in the game. In fact, I suspect it's already in the game. Essentially, Trueskill 1, just a brief overview. I believe Trueskill 1 is an attempt to slightly improve upon the ELO system for a team-based game by adapting it in order to be better at matchmaking team-based games. It's really not that much different from the elo system. It's really not that controversial, Trueskill 1, in my opinion, after having read through the whole thing. It doesn't really mention using any other metrics besides win and loss in order to determine, players' ability uh, to win the game and to climb. But Trueskill 2, obviously, and I haven't read the paper on it yet, so we'll find out what my initial reaction is. But Trueskill 2 has more potential problems because, like I said in the first video, Microsoft has advertised Trueskill 2 as a very clearly a system that can improve further on Trueskill 1 at placing people more quickly into the appropriate rank where they're winning 50% of their games by using metrics other than win and loss data. So again, in the long run, if a player plays 100, 200 plus ranked games, they're going to have enough win and loss data that under Trueskill, under ELO, under MMR, under Trueskill 2, regardless, the player's going to end up at the rank where they win 50% of their games. So keep that in mind, right? In the long run, regardless of the system, players are going to end up at the same rank. Based on how good they are at beating the players in that rank and the ranks below that. Now, if what it affects is like I said, if you don't have that many games played, what we can do is we can take 20, 30, 40, maybe 100 different metrics on the way that high elo players play, and we can say, okay, this is the profile of a player who is able to win 50% of their games in Masters, or the profile of somebody who's able to win 50% of their games in Diamond. And we compare the profile of a new player who's playing the game in normals and in ranked for the first couple, for the beginning. And essentially in that beginning stage, we are able to rely on less win and loss data because we don't have that much data for it, and more on these other metrics to determine how good a player is actually playing, whether they win or lose. And a lot of people pointed out, rightfully so in the comments, and I was surprised how well everybody took this, which I'm glad to see, is a lot of low elo players were actually saying like, hey, I think that it's really good if it is accurate, that I can like lose less MMR if I'm playing really well. I think that that's awesome. It'd be nice if we could see it, of course, because then you'd actually know that that's happening. But the idea, right, that this system is supposed to work. So that's Trueskill 2. Trueskill 2 is about taking Trueskill 1, which was just an improvement on the ELO system for a team-based game, using just wins and losses. Trueskill 2 is specifically designed to use other metrics to speed up the process of getting somebody there. So whereas under the old system, it might have taken a huge number of games to get somebody to the rank that they belong at, where they're winning 50% of their games. I keep putting that caveat on there because every time I say the rank that somebody belongs at or the rank that somebody deserves or the appropriate rank, people think that like, it's not actually the deserved or appropriate rank because it's all rigged and blah, blah, blah. And it's the algorithm just thinks that that's the appropriate rank. It's not that the algorithm thinks that it's the appropriate rank. It's that it puts you in that rank and then you win 50% of your games. If it put you in that rank and it was wrong and you were winning more than 50% of your games, you would just climb. It's not anything crazy. Anyways, been yapping for a long time. Let's actually get into the paper. So you get the idea. Trueskill 1, improvement on the ELO system, expanding it to work on a team-wide basis. Trueskill 2 is, because we don't have enough win and loss data for the first 50, 40, 30, 20, 10, 5 games that somebody's played in ranked, let's use other metrics about how the player's playing the game compared to other people who are playing the same champion as them, let's say in League, or compared to other people in the same role. Let's compare metrics and see if we can't figure out where this person's appropriate rank is faster, get them to a rank where they're having more, more of a 50% win rate quicker, so that person, is not smurfing and ruining games for lower elo players, or on the flip side, getting bored and quitting the game or getting frustrated because they're only winning 30, 20% of their games. So let's get into it. So Trueskill is a Bayesian skill rating system. I remember what Bayesian well, I don't remember what it is or what it means, but I know the word from economics. But we'll see. It's like a distribution. Abstract. And this is going to be the most important part. The most important part is the abstract, the introduction, and the conclusion. So a lot of times when we read these papers, there's a lot of math gobbledygook. But let's start by, we do this all the time when we're reading these things. Let's start by reading the abstract, reading the introduction, and then reading the conclusion, and then we'll have a good idea of what's going on here. And then we can try to slog our way through some of the math gobbledygook. Like I said, the math, as complicated as it is to read for a layman or for me, is it's not going to actually teach us anything crazy, right? It's just how to actually implement it. Abstract. We present a new Bayesian skill rating system, which can be viewed as a generalization of the ELO system used in chess. The new system tracks the uncertainty about player skills, explicitly models draws, can deal with any number of competing entities, and can infer individual skills from team results. Inference is performed by approximate message passing on a factor graph representation of the model. We present experimental evidence on the increased accuracy and convergence speed of the system compared to ELO, and report on our experience with the new rating system running in a large-scale commercial online gaming service under the name Trueskill. Introduction. Skill ratings in competitive games and sports serve three main functions. First, they allow players to be matched with other players of similar skill, leading to interesting balanced matches. Second, the ratings can be made available to the players and to the interested public, and thus stimulate interest and competition. Thirdly, ratings can be used as a criteria of qualification for tournaments. With the advent of online gaming, the interest in rating systems has increased dramatically because the quality of the online experience of millions of players each day are at stake. In 1959, Arpad Elo developed a statistical rating system for chess, which was adopted by the World Chess Federation, FIDE, or FIDE, I don't know, in 1970. The key idea behind the ELO system is to model the probability of the possible game outcomes as a function of the two players' skill ratings, S1 and S2, so the skill of player 1 and the skill of player 2. In each game, player I exhibits performance PI, performance player I, is approximate to N as a function of PI, SI, so the performance of player I, the skill of player I, and the third variable is beta squared. Beta is essentially like other. Normally distributed around their skills. So a normal distribution is like a bell curve. And so essentially they're saying, let's take a look. They're essentially saying here that the player's skill is in the middle of the bell curve. This really bothers me that this picture is not centered in the middle of the bell curve quite properly. Okay, so, this is the player's, average skill, and then sometimes they way outperform themselves and sometimes they way underperform themselves. So that's the idea, right? So that basically their performance is normally distributed about their skills or around their skills. SI, which is the skill of player I, with a fixed variance. So again, B squared is variance. It's like other. Maybe it's not other. Maybe it's the size of the variance here, actually. The probability that player 1 wins is given by the probability that his performance PI or P1, performance in like game 1, let's say, exceeds the opponent's performance P2. We're going to get into the math here, so let's go to the conclusion really quickly, and then we'll go through this. Oh, here we go. Let's start here, actually. Experiments and online service. 4.1 Halo 2 beta test. So originally, Trueskill was tested during the beta test for Halo, and then used as Halo's matchmaking system. In order to assess the performance of the Trueskill algorithm, we performed experiments on the game outcome dataset generated by Bungie Studios during the beta testing of the Xbox title Halo 2. The dataset consists of thousands of game outcomes for 4 different types of games: 8 players against each other, free-for-all, 4 players versus 4 players, small teams, 1 player versus 1 player, head-to-head, and 8 players versus 8 players, or large teams. The draw margin, which is written by this little weird thing, I don't know what it is, for each factor node was set by counting the fraction of draws between teams, empirical draw probability, and relate the draw margin to the chance of drawing by blah, 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 predictive performance. The following table presents the prediction error fraction of teams that were predicted in the wrong order before the game. For both algorithms, column 2 and 3, this measure is difficult to interpret because of the interplay of ranking and matchmaking. Depending on the unknown true skills of all players, the smallest achievable prediction error could be as big as 50%. In order to compensate for this latent unknown variable, we arranged a competition between ELO and Trueskill. We let each system predict which games it considered most tightly matched and presented them to the other algorithm. The algorithm that predicts more game outcomes correctly has a better ability to identify tight matches. For Trueskill, we use the matchmaking criterion 7, and for ELO, we use the difference in ELO scores, skill rating of player 1 minus skill rating of player 2. So here we have the results, and they're saying that in free-for-all, small teams, head-to-head, and large teams, the it can be seen from column 4 and 5 of this table that Trueskill is significantly better at predicting tight matches. The challenge set was always 20% of the total number of games in each game mode. So essentially, I think what it's saying is that in these matches, ELO was predicting whether the game was like super tight, meaning that like it's very 50-50. And it thought, in the ELO system thought that more games or a higher percentage of games were really close, whereas Trueskill was able to distinguish that less of those games were close than they actually were. So let's see. So there was a full test and then a challenged test. And so the full test would have been just on the whole, on the whole. Free for all, you can see that Trueskill performed about 2% better. ELO performed just slightly better, like 0.3% better in small teams. And then head-to-head, Trueskill performed about 1% better. And in large teams, Trueskill also performed about 1% better. Now, in the challenged pool, which I believe were the tighter matches, Trueskill outperformed in every category. They outperformed in 9 out of their 8, or not 9 out of 8, 7 out of 8 of their test categories. And we can see here that in these challenging matches, Trueskill is even more significantly better than ELO at predicting tight matches, where Trueskill was 3% better, it was 5% better, then it was 10% better, and then it was like 15% better, nearly 15% better in large teams. And so we can see here those results that Trueskill seem to be doing a better job than ELO of predicting the outcome of the game, more or less. Match quality. One of the main applications of a rating system is to be able to match players of a similar skill. In order to compare the ability of ELO and Trueskill on this task, we sorted the games based on match quality assigned by both systems to each game. If the match was truly tight, then it would be very likely to observe a draw. Thus, we plot the fraction of draws out of all possible draws, accumulating over the match quality order assigned by each system. In the graph on the right, we see that Trueskill is significantly better than ELO for both the free-for-all and head-to-head game mode, but fails in small teams. This is possibly due to the violation of the additive team performance model, as most games in this mode are capture the flag games. Win probability. The perceived quality of a rating system for players is in terms of their winning ratio. If the winning ratio is high, then the player was erroneously assigned too weak opposition by the ranking system, and vice versa. In a second experiment, we processed the Halo 2 dataset, but rejected games that did not meet a certain match quality threshold. For the games thus selected, we computed the winning ratio of each player, and depending on the minimal number of games played by each player, measured the average deviation of the winning probability from 50%, which is the optimal winning ratio. The resulting plot on the right for the head-to-head game mode shows that with Trueskill, I guess this is a typo and they meant to say even. Even players with very few games got mostly fair matches, with a winning probability within 35% to 65%. So we can see here it's very small. Let's zoom in on this graph here. We can see here that, we want to have, let's see. ELO is here, Trueskill is here. Average change of win probability from 50%. So basically we can see that the more games you play, the smaller your win rate is going to be from 50%, because the more you play, the more accurately it should be able to place you in your peak rank. And we can also see that, because Trueskill is down here with like a 15 to 23 percent up or down from 50%, that essentially this is doing a much better job. And then you can see here that, like, with ELO, it's actually doing a slower job of matching somebody into the appropriate rank, because there's a higher standard deviation. Some people are winning way too many games, some people are losing way too many games. And I don't know what Halo 2 means here, if this was like a different system that Halo 2 had, or if this was the average between the two because they were using both, or something like that. But obviously whatever other system this was also performing worse. Convergence properties. And here we can see, like I was just going to say, could we see, maybe 200, 300 games, because we know in League it takes probably 200 games, I would say, to appropriately measure somebody's rank. Convergence properties. Firstly, we plotted two exemplary convergence trajectories for two of the highest rated players in the free-for-all game mode: solid line, Trueskill, dash line, ELO. As can be seen, Trueskill automatically chooses the correct learning rate, whereas ELO only slowly converges to the target skill. In fact, Trueskill comes close to the information theoretic limit of n log of n bits to encode a ranking of n players for 8-player games. The information theoretic limit is log n divided by log 8 is about 5 games per player on average, and the observed convergence for these two players is about 10 games, exclamation point. So basically what they're saying here, we got to see, again, it said ELO is the solid line is Trueskill, dash line is ELO. So we can see here that the ELO system is like you're slowly climbing to your appropriate rank and then peaking off. Whereas with Trueskill, which is this black line here, we can see that you're maybe immediately shooting up a little bit too high, or maybe immediately shooting up a little bit too low, and then very quickly converging on the appropriate rank. So you get more matchmaking variance in the beginning, but you get to your rank faster. Now, this is interesting because it does propose a interesting problem, which is we did say that it's important to get players to their appropriate rank where they're winning 50% of their games as quickly as possible. But, to be honest, in defense of the ELO system here, if you had to choose between a steady climb upwards, where you were placed too low and winning well over 50% of your games and kind of like learning the game and climbing along the way, I think obviously most new players would prefer to have like a slow, steady climb upwards rather than a highly variant start where all of a sudden as a new player I'm matched up against platinum players to see if I'm a smurf, and then I'm guaranteed to lose that game and I'm not going to have a good time, and then I'm thrown back down. Because this is not a small number of games. I mean, I see the variance, this crazy variance here, really sort of coming to an end at maybe right in the middle of this, about 25 games played. But I think that if you have really high variance in those first 25 games, that could pose a problem for new players. I mentioned a friend of mine way back in season 3 when my friend group first started playing solo queue, and he ended up getting placed into silver 4 while a lot of us were getting placed into like bronze 3. And he ended up having a terrible time, went something like 3-19, maybe even lost like 19 games in a row or something crazy. And he had such a bad time with his first 20 games after his placements that he essentially ended up quitting the game or not being interested in playing ranked anymore. It's something that I think happens a lot with games like Age of Empires or whatever in ranked, because you get in there and then you're supposed to just lose, or chess, and you're supposed to just lose over and over again for like 20 or 30 games until your rank bottoms out. And that's not fun for anybody to do. No one wants to queue up and get beat up like that over and over and over again. And so I actually wonder if the slow convergence on your rank, while it's slower at putting a player in the appropriate rank, gives a better ranked experience to the new player and is more likely to keep them around, rather than a system that throws them into like a plat game or throws them into an emerald game and they lose and then they go way back down, and that throws them into a bronze game. And I mean, that's just a little bit wild, isn't it? I don't think that's what people expect when they queue up for ranked. Maybe that's a little bit dramatic though. But obviously, they're both converging, and it does look like the ELO system is a little bit slower to converge on the appropriate rank, because the ELO system obviously, according to this trend, is still not up where it should be for these players here, even at 100 games. And that goes in line with what I was talking about, that we might expect to see then that it takes 200 or 300 games to get to the appropriate skill level. Okay, so I'm trying to figure out what's going on with these other lines. So those are the two black lines. It said it was comparing two of the highest rated players in the free-for-all game mode. So this was one player. They must have stopped playing at about, a little over 100 games. And then here's the second player, and we can see a similar effect. Like, they both started at a low elo, and then he kind of slowly and gradually climbed. And then at about 200 games, his Trueskill rating and his elo rating basically converged on top of each other. And there was enough of a sample size that regardless of what system you're using, you're able to seed the player into a rank where they're winning 50% of their games. And so now essentially this is the question, is do we want to have more variance in the beginning, but the player is more likely to win about 50% of their games from the start, so much quicker placed into a higher rank? Or do we want to have less variance in the beginning, everyone starting at the same rank, from the same place, from the same playing field, and better players are just able to climb out over time and converge on their appropriate rank at around 200 games played? But it's also going to put everyone at the same starting point. Which maybe is more fair. It's going to be a much more transparent system. It's going to be easy for people to understand. You're going to have less variance in the beginning as a new player, so you won't get placed in games that are like way above your rank to test you or way below your rank to test you. Instead, you'll just immediately be fed into very average games. And if you're consistently able to win in those average games, then you'll climb if you're like a Smurf, or if you're a new player who's excelling at the game and a prodigy. And if you're, struggling, then you will slowly climb. I think the difficulty is, obviously, I would say that in my personal opinion, it might even be worth sacrificing the speed at getting someone to their appropriate rank in favor of a simpler to understand, more integral system. But you do have to say that with ELO as well, imagine on the opposite end, because we're looking at two really good players, imagine on the opposite end, you could have the opposite thing happening. So this seems really nice, these dotted lines, which is the ELO system, because it's a nice, slow, gradual climb upwards, maybe even gives you extra time to learn and improve, so that, rather than getting stuck, right here, if you're slowly going up, you can kind of slowly continue to improve and get better as you're playing those games on your way up, and then your peak will end up being higher. So obviously, the individual player who's going up would prefer that, but imagine the opposite scenario. Now imagine you have a player who's like deserves to play at like an iron level, and they're not very good at the game, or a newer player who doesn't really know the game at all. Do you want that player to have a slow, gradual fall? So we're looking at two good players, right? So the inverse could be true. So would you rather have a slow, gradual fall to Iron 4 from like Silver 4 that might require you to lose a lot more than you win in order to get to the rank that you can actually win 50% of your games at? Or would you rather throw that player into like one game that's completely unwinnable for them because it's way too high rank, and then Trueskill is able to quickly and appropriately figure out that person should be way lower rank, and then it's going to put them down into bronze and then down into iron, and then very quickly, like we talked about, it's going to converge on the rank that they can win 50% of their games on. Let's say it's iron 2 or something like that. It's going to converge on that much, much quicker, and so they'll have a better experience if they get to win 50% of their games faster than they would if they were stuck falling. And keep in mind, right, that when we're talking about this, what we really care about, or should care about, with this system is not what happens to Smurfs. It should be about what happens to new players. And the Trueskill system is probably better for new players because it doesn't put them in a state where they have to lose 20 more games than they win in order to get to the appropriate rank. Instead, it can quickly, after 5 or 10 games, it's going to converge on pretty appropriate rank for that player. And so that is way, way better, because they're unlikely to have quit the game after 5 or 10 games unless they just genuinely didn't like the game. And so if they're appropriately placed, or if the system is able to converge on their appropriate rank after only 10 games, like this is saying, that's way better for new players. Now for Smurfs, it will also help Smurfs go up faster, but they won't get to pub stomp as much. But I think it's a misconception. I don't think that people play on Smurfs. I think low elo players imagine that high elo players play on Smurfs to like stomp low elo players, when in reality, I think most games that high elo players play on Smurfs is because their main account got banned, or they want to have a backup account. They want to have an account to practice other champions on. They can't win as much on their main account with. They want to have an account to practice a new role on. And even though they may end up being better at that role because of their knowledge about the game and things like that, in the beginning, for a very short period of time, they do start out as, like, if you're playing a completely different role, very lost and almost like a silver or a gold player for a couple of games. But a good player will pick up the role very quickly, and then not play like that anymore and start winning a lot of games and climbing. So, that's about where we're at with that one. Okay, then Trueskill in Xbox 360 Live. Xbox Live is Microsoft's console online gaming service. It lets players play together across the world in hundreds of different titles. As of September 2005, Xbox Live had over 2 million subscribed users who had accrued over 1.3 billion hours on the service. The new and improved Xbox 360 Live service offers automatic player rating and matchmaking using the Trueskill algorithm. The system processed hundreds of thousands of games per day, making it one of the largest applications of the Bayesian inference to date. In Xbox Live, we used a scale given by a prior... We're getting back into the math. Okay, we don't care about this part. Okay, let's read this part. Note that the matchmaking process can be viewed as a process of sequential experimental design. Since the quality of a match is determined by the unpredictability of its outcome, the goals of matchmaking and finding the most informative matches are aligned. As a fascinating byproduct, we have the opportunity to study Trueskill in action with player populations of hundreds of thousands of players. While we are only just beginning to analyze the vast amounts of resulting data, we have already made some interesting observations. 1. Games differ in the number of effective skill levels. Games of chance, e.g., single game backgammon or Uno, have a narrow skill distribution, while games of skill, e.g., semi-realistic racing games, have a wide skill distribution. 2. Matchmaking and skill display result in a feedback loop back to the players, who often view their skill estimate as a reward or punishment for performance. Some players try to protect or boost their skill rating by either stopping to play, by carefully choosing their opponents, or by cheating. 3. The total skill distribution is shifted to below the prior distribution if players new to the system consistently lose their first few games. When a skill reset was initiated, we found that the effect disappeared with tighter matchmaking enforced. Conclusion: Trueskill is a globally deployed Bayesian rating algorithm based on approximate message passing in factor graphs. It has many theoretical and practical advantages over the ELO system and has been demonstrated to work well in practice. While we specifically focused on the Trueskill algorithm, many more interesting models can be developed within the factor graph framework presented here. In particular, the factor graph formulation is applicable to the family of constraint classification models that encompasses a wide range of multi-class and ranking problems. Also, instead of ranking individual entities, one can use feature vectors to build a ranking function, e.g. for web pages represented as bags of words. Finally, we are planning to run a full-time independent EP analysis across chess games to obtain Trueskill ratings for chess masters of all times. So we can go through some of the math, but I will tell you I've read through the math of the first one, and as far as I understand it, there's nothing in the math of the first paper that is going to say, oh, we're using this metric as, part of the rating system. Really, it focuses a lot around, just updating the ELO system as a team-based game. So if we look at some of the equations, right, that they talk about here and do our best to read them. Some of these I'm not going to be able to read so well. We can see here, we were getting into the probability that player 1 wins is given by the probability that his performance exceeds the opponent's performance. So P is a function of P1 being greater than P2. I don't know what this means, this little line here in the middle. And S, maybe and S1, and S2. Which equals, I don't know what this means, S1 minus S2 over the square root of 2 times beta. Where whatever this little thing is, Greek letter, denotes the cumulative density of a zero mean unit variance Gaussian. After the game, the skill ratings of S1 and S2 are updated such that the observed game outcome becomes more likely, and S1 plus S2 equals a constant is maintained. So what this means is that after, one player wins, it's updated to reflect that it is more likely that that player wins in the future. And because S1 plus S2 are a constant, that means that any ELO or MMR, whatever you want to call it, any skill rating that player S1 gains from beating player S2 comes directly from player S2. So an equal amount of MMR or whatever is taken from player S2 as is given to player S1. It's a zero sum. The rank system is a zero sum game. Let y equal +1 if player 1 wins, and y equal -1 if player 2 wins, y equals 0 if a draw occurs. We don't have to worry about that for League. Then the resulting linearized ELO update is given by S1 changes to S1 plus y, or the change in y. Y is the change after y. Y is change, and the update of skill of player 2 goes from the skill of player 2 to the new skill of player 2 minus the y change, and change equals the k factor, which is alpha times beta times the square root of pi times y plus 1 over 2 minus that Greek letter times the skill of player 1 minus the skill of player 2 divided by the square root of 2 times beta, blah, blah, blah. Where 0, here it says what alpha is, where 0 is less than alpha and alpha is less than 1, determines the weighting of the new evidence versus the old estimate. So it sounds really complicated, right? All this means is that, how we were saying that like player S1 would gain some rating from player S2. If alpha equals 1, that means that player S1, it's like they gain all of their MMR. So imagine if you played in a rating system where alpha equals 0, there would be no change. Your MMR would always stay the same. It would never change because you wouldn't gain any rating from player S2 if you beat them. If alpha equals 1, you would gain all of their MMR. Obviously, that's not appropriate because if you ever lost, you would lose all of your MMR. And so players' rank would constantly be like resetting. Like every time they lost a game, your rank would reset to 0 ELO, which would be crazy. It's be like you're not allowed to lose. And the top rated player would probably be whoever actually managed to win like 10 or 20 games in a row. And they'd have some crazy high ELO because they would have stolen everybody's ELO. It's a bit like if you're playing on a hardcore Minecraft server where if you kill somebody, you permanently gain all of their HP or something like that, and they get banned from the server. Anyways, interesting. But obviously, the way that we have it is it's a very small number. So let's say that somebody has 2,000 rating and you want them to gain 20 ELO from the other person. Math, you might have them gain, let's see, 2 would be 2% of 200. So it'd be, what, out of 2,000? Maybe it's 2%, something like that. You get the idea. So, they gain like 2%. So it would be like 0.02 would be alpha, for example, if you wanted it to be something like that. So alpha is just, how much ELO you get to steal. Most currently used ELO variants use a logistic distribution instead of a Gaussian because it is argued to provide a better fit for chess data. From the point of view of statistics, the ELO system addresses the problem of eliminating the paired comparison data with the Gaussian variant corresponding to the Thurston Case 5 model and the logistic variant to the Bradley-Terry model. We don't need to pretend to know what these things are. In the ELO system, a player's rating is regarded as provisional as long as it's based on less than a fixed number of games, say 20 games. This problem was addressed by Mark Glickman's Bayesian rating system, GLICO, which introduces the idea of modeling the belief about a player's skill as a Gaussian belief distribution characterized by a mean mu and a variance of standard deviation squared. That's what that means, right? I hope I'm cooking. An important new application of skill rating systems are multiplayer online games that greatly benefit from the ability to create online matches in which the participating players have roughly even skills and hence enjoyable, fair, and exciting game experiences. Multiplayer online games often provide the following challenges. Game outcome. So let's stop here actually and say what this means. So basically, what they're saying is what we've seen before later on in the paper, that your ELO rating is provisional unless you've played a ton of games. And the whole point is that we need to get a player to the appropriate rank faster and prioritize that, even if we give the player a little bit of variance in the beginning of some really unwinnable games and some really like easy games that aren't that challenging. We'd rather test players much higher and much lower than the ELO system would by starting everybody at the same rank so that we can appropriately rank players quicker. So even though in the long run we get to the same rank for the player, which is whatever their skill level is capable at winning 50% of their games at, whatever rank that is, we get to the same result in the long run, but in the short run using Trueskill, we're able to essentially find the player's appropriate rating faster than the ELO system in order to prevent new players from having to win 40% of their games for 200 games to get to Iron 4, or preventing Smurfs from getting to play 100 or 200 games in low elo instead of very quickly after 10, 20, 30 games getting them into the appropriate rank that they should be at. Now, of course, we could just ban smurfing, and that would have its positives like we talked about in the beginning. You wouldn't really have to worry about that then. And you could give players that certain starting point, and maybe it would be worth it to have them be able to slowly and gradually climb and win a lot of games if they start too low. That's going to feel good to a lot of players. It's going to feel rewarding. A lot of the reason why players say that they feel... So let's, address a couple of things here. One of the reasons why players feel like the rating system is preventing them from climbing is because the rating system is trying to put you at a rank where you win 50% of your games. It's not trying to make you win 50% of your games at whatever rank you're currently at now. It's trying to make you win 50% of your games by putting you at the appropriate rank. And so if you're winning 50% of your games, it's not because the ELO system is holding you back or trying to keep you winning 50% of your games. It's because it's found the rank that you deserve to be at where you are capable of winning 50% of your games, and it's sticking you there until you can prove to the system that you can win more than 50% of your games there. And we see it literally day in and day out. Players improve, they get better at the game, and all of a sudden they're not winning 50% of their games anymore and they're climbing out of their rank. In fact, most of the time when I look at low elo players OP.GGs, they're playing 50 different champions this season. They have one champion that they like to play that they win 60% of their games on, and another champion that they like to play that they win 20% of their games on, or something crazy, or 40% or whatever, maybe more realistic. And they continue to pick the 40% win rate champion just as much as the 60% win rate champion. And so they keep themselves stuck at their rank because they won't let go of this champion they can't play. And if they were to just play their main champion that they're winning 60% of their games on, they would actually just climb out of their rank, and yet they think that they're stuck. So anyways, and then the other thing, I guess, is that, let's see, what does it say here? An important new application, blah, blah, blah. Game outcomes often refer to teams of players, yet a skill rating for individual players is needed for matchmaking, and more than 2 players or teams compete, such that the game outcome is a permutation of teams or players rather than just a winner or loser. In this paper, we present a new rating system, Trueskill, that addresses both of these challenges in a principled Bayesian framework. We express the model as a factor graph and use appropriate message passing to infer the marginal belief distribution over the skill of each player. In section 4, we present experimental results on real-world data generated by Bungie Studios during the beta testing of the Xbox title Halo 2, and we report on our experience with the rating system running in the Xbox Live service. So again, we get into some pretty heavy math here. Should we try our best to go through it? And then we've read this part. We'll try. But I would recommend, if you're not really that interested in the math, keeping in mind that I've read through this before and you're not going to, get some crazy information out of it. I'll have timestamps, and I would recommend that probably at this point you might want to skip to the, unless you're really interested in hearing me yap or in the math, I would recommend skipping to the Trueskill 2 section of the video, so that you can go through like the abstract introduction and conclusion of that one and see what we learned from that one, because that's going to be the more interesting one anyways. Where were we here? So, two, factor graphs for ranking. From among a population of n players, so n is the set of players, 1 to n in a game, let k teams compete in a match. The team assignments are specified by k non-overlapping subsets AJ. I don't know what this symbol means. Basically, you've got a set of 1 to n players of the player population. AI, I don't know what this means. This is like conjoining sets or something like that, or something weird. Some statistic thing with sets or whatever. AI something AJ equals null if I does not equal j. The outcome R equals R1 through RK, or the set of R1 through RK, or something like that. Something 1 through K is specified by a rank RJ for each team, J, with R1 indicating the winner, and with the possibility of draws when Ri equals Rj. The ranks are derived from the scoring rules of the game. We model the probability P, R something S, and A. So P is a function of R, S, and A. Of the game outcome R, given the skills S of the participating players in the team assignments, A something equals the set of A1 through AK. From Bayes' rules, we obtain the posterior distribution. P as a function of SRA equals P as a function of RSA times P as a function of S divided by P as a function of R and A. We assume a factorizing Gaussian prior distribution. P as a function of S equals, I don't even know what this one is, something from, we're lost here. We're absolutely lost. This is like doing homework all over again. This is so sick. Something to the end. I mean, it's like a summation, but it's different than a summation. So I don't know what's going on with this thing. Can I Google whatever this is? Q. Well, it's not a Q. So that's not right. I copy pasted, I get Q. So that can't be right. Anyways, there's some math. Basically, it's saying here, blah, blah, blah. Each player is assumed to exhibit a performance in the game centered around their skill with fixed variance of beta 2, or beta squared. I mean, the performance of TJ of Team J is modeled as the sum of the performance of its members. Team J equals the summation of I as set of A something or other performance of I. Let us reorder the teams ascending order of rank. So they've got all the teams. Disregarding draws, the probability of a game outcome R is modeled as blah, blah, blah. That is, the order of the performance generates the order in the game outcome. If draws are permitted, the winning outcome RJ is less than RJ plus 1 requires something, and the draw outcome requires something else, where something is a draw margin that can be calculated from the assumed probability of a draw. We need to be able to report skill estimates after each game, and will therefore use an online learning scheme referred to as Gaussian density filtering. The posterior distribution is approximated to be Gaussian and is used as the prior distribution for the next game. So this is an example of a Trueskill factor graph. There are 4 types of variables: SI for the skills of all players, PI for the performances of all players, TI for the performances of all teams, and DJ for the team performance differences. The first row of factors encode the product prior. The product of the remaining factors characterizes the likelihood of game outcome. Team 1 greater than Team 2 equals Team 3. The arrows indicate the optimal message passing schedule. First, all light arrow messages are updated from top to bottom in the following. The schedule over the team performance difference nodes are iterated in the order of the numbers. Finally, the posterior over the skills is computed by updating all the dark arrow messages from bottom to top. Skills are expected to vary over time. A Gaussian dynamics factor can be introduced, which leads to an additive variance component in the subsequent prior. Let us consider a game with K equals 3 teams with team assignments A1, A2, and A3. Let us further assume that Team 1 is the winner and that Teams 2 and 3 draw. We can represent the resulting joint distribution, P as a function of S, P, T, R, and A, by the factor graph depicted in Figure 1. A factor graph is a bipartite graph consisting of variable and factor nodes shown in Figure 1 as gray circles and black squares respectively. The function represented by a factor graph, in our case the joint distribution P is a function of S, P, T, R, and A, is given by the product of all potential functions associated with each factor. The structure of the factor graph gives information about the dependencies of the factors involved and is the basis of efficient interference algorithms. Returning to Bayes' rule, the quantities of interest are the posterior distribution, P is a function of S, I, R, and A over skills given game outcome R and team associations A. The P as a function of SI, R, and A are calculated from the joint distribution, integrating out of the... Oh, we got some calculus here. Integrating... Is that calculus? I don't even remember. Integrating out of the individual performances PI and the team performances TI. So we get some more math. Update rules for the approximate marginals for different values of the draw margin for a 2-team game. This is talking about tying. Nobody cares about tying. Anyways, you get the idea. I gotta be honest, we're not learning anything else from this. We should move on to Trueskill 2. Paper's in the description if you want to bother reading that. Okay, Trueskill 2. I will have to read the whole thing because I haven't read it yet. So I'm going to slog through the whole one. Unfortunately, it's also 3 times as long as the other one. Let's read the introduction and the abstract first, shall we? See if we can glean anything. And the conclusion. Online multiplayer games such as Gears of War and Halo use skill-based matchmaking to give players fair and enjoyable matches. They depend on a skill rating system to infer accurate player skills from historical data. Trueskill is a popular and effective skill rating system, working from only the winner and loser of each game. This paper presents an extension to Trueskill that incorporates additional information that is readily available in online shooters, such as player experience, membership in a squad, the number of kills a player scored, tendency to quit, and skill in other game modes. This extension, which we call Trueskill 2, is shown to significantly improve the accuracy of skill ratings computed from Halo 5 matches. Trueskill 2 predicts historical match outcomes with 68% accuracy compared to 52% accuracy for Trueskill. So they're already claiming a significant increase in predicting historical match outcomes with this new system of Trueskill 2 as opposed to Trueskill 1. Okay, 1. Introduction. When a player wants to play an online multiplayer game such as Halo or Gears of War, they join a queue of waiting players, and a matchmaking service decides who they will play with. The matchmaking service makes its decision based on several criteria, including the geographic location and skill rating. Our goal is to improve the fairness of matches by improving the accuracy of the skill ratings flowing into the matchmaking service. The skill rating of a player is an estimate of their ability to win the next match based on the results of their previous matches. A typical match result lists the players involved, their team assignments, the length of the match, how long each player played, and the final score of each team. A skill rating system must make assumptions about how these match results relate to player skill. We follow previous work by representing these assumptions as a probabilistic generative model. That is a process that generates random player skills and random match results from the skills. Bayesian inference in this generative model gives the optimal skill ratings under the assumptions. A skill rating system is only as good as its underlying assumptions. This paper focuses on making skill ratings more accurate by making better assumptions. We describe the process by which we arrived at our generative model, how to evaluate the model, and how to estimate the parameters of the model. A variety of different generative models can be found in previous work. For example, Dan Gauthier et al. 2008 extended Trueskill for two-player games by giving each player an additional number describing their ability to force draws, which could evolve over time. Glickman in 2001 used a model for two-player games where each player has an additional number describing their skill volatility, which could evolve over time. Chen et al. 2016 used a model where each player had a different but unchanging skill rating for each character that they could play in the game. Menke et al. 2006 used a model that accounted for map and server effects on the outcome of matches. Chen and Joachim's 2016 used a model where skill rating was a vector of numbers to allow intransitive dominances between players. Unfortunately, none of these models have the qualities needed by a modern game studio. After consulting with the makers of Gears of War and Halo, we have found that their top priorities are support for team games. The system should support matches with any number of teams and any number of players on each team. Changeable skill ratings. It must be possible for a player's skill rating to change no matter how many matches they've played in the past. This ensures that players receive meaningful feedback on their performance. 3. Compatibility with an existing matchmaker. Existing matchmakers assume skill is described by a single number. Players can easily understand a single ordered skill ranking. 4. Aligned incentives. The skill rating system should create incentives that align with the spirit of the game. For example, consider a team game where players cooperate to achieve a goal. An improperly designed skill rating system could encourage players to impede their teammates. As another example, consider a system that increased skill rating according to the number of the times a player healed themselves. This creates an incentive for a player to repeatedly injure themselves so that they could be healed. In general, the more control that a player has over a quantity, the less useful it is for skill rating. 5. Minimal training data requirements. The most important time to have good matchmaking is immediately after the launch of a game. The other way you could put this, right, is it's not just after the launch of a game, but if you have a new player, this is like for a game like Halo or Gears of War, but if we're talking about League, this could be like the most important time to have good matchmaking is when a player is new to the game and determining whether they're going to keep playing ranked or if they're going to quit. Unfortunately, this is also when there's the least amount of data available to train a model. Even if the game has a large player base, there tends to be a small amount of training data per player. Low computational cost. Skill updates are done on servers hosted by the game studio, and skill ratings are stored in a database hosted by the game studio. This means that skill representation should be small and updates should be cheap. Minimal tuning. Game studios generally do not have personnel with the knowledge and free time available to tune the skill rating system after launch, but they do make plenty of other changes to the game, such as adding new game modes, new player abilities, and rebalancing game mechanics. The skill rating system would need to automatically adapt to these kind of changes. Our solution is to start with the Trueskill model, which already enjoys properties 1 through 6, and make judicious changes. So 1 through 6, so that's everything but minimal tuning. And that is like one of the least important metrics on here as far as like we're concerned about, right? About how it actually determines the rank. And make judicious changes that preserve these properties. A skill rating in Trueskill 2 is a single number with the same meaning in terms of win rate as a Trueskill rating. Thus, any matchmaker that accepts classic Trueskill ratings also accepts Trueskill 2 ratings. Trueskill 2 only changes the way that skills are inferred from historical data. Now, this is important. Trueskill 2 changes the way that skills are inferred from historical data. Property 7 is achieved by performing automatic parameter estimation over a batch of historical data. Trueskill 2 operates in two modes, an online mode that propagates skill ratings forward in time, and a batch mode that infers parameters and skills over time, also known as Trueskill through time. Both modes are based on the same probabilistic generative model. They only correspond to different approximations to the Bayesian posterior. Briefly, the classic Trueskill model makes the following assumptions. Each player has a latent skill value that represents their expected contribution to a team. A player's performance in a game is a noisy sample of their skill. The performance of a team, what they mean by this is that your performance in a single game is a sample of your skill, but it's noisy, meaning it's not accurate, because you're going to need to see the data through the noise over a large sample size in order to determine how a player is performing over a lot of games in order to determine how good that player actually is. 2, the performance of a team is the weighted sum of the performances of its players, where the weight is the fraction of the time the player spent on the team. 3, if a team's performance is greater than the other team by a certain margin, the team wins. Otherwise, the game is a draw. When learning skills from data, only the team win-loss information is used, not scores. When learning skills from data, only the team win-loss information is used, not scored. That's important. That's really important. Now, I don't know if it's going to stay that way or if it's just talking about in this one aspect. But if that's true for the whole system, then that's really important, because as Riot said, they can potentially use Trueskill 2 without having to use other metrics than win and loss data. And the way that they put that, even in the initial Reddit post that sort of sparked concern, was that, we are not implementing something that uses something other than win-loss, and nothing like that's been implemented yet. But that was 6 months ago, and they said that they wanted to implement Trueskill 2, and Trueskill 2 is marketed as being able to rank people faster by using their historical data, not just from wins and losses, but from other metrics in order to place them faster. I don't know how you would improve on Trueskill 1 in terms of placing people faster without using more data that you have to get from somewhere. And the only other that, you're already using all the win-loss data that you can. Riot's already even using win and loss data from normals. So the only thing that you could possibly do to infer more data would be to use other metrics besides win and loss. So we'll see about this one. 4, player skills evolve over time according to a random walk. An increase or decrease in skill is assumed equally likely. 5, a player's skill in a game mode is assumed independent of their skill in other modes. That's important. The Trueskill 2 model modifies the classic model in the following ways. 1, a player's latent skill is inferred from their individual statistics such as kill and death counts, in addition to team win and loss. Okay, so this is important. See, we just read, right in 3, when learning skills from data, only the team win-loss information is used, not score. but that was just related to when learning skills from data. The Trueskill 2 model does say that it modifies the classic model by determining a player's latent skill or inferring their latent skill from their individual statistics, such as kill and death counts, in addition to team win/loss. So if Riot were to implement, or has already implemented, Trueskill 2, which they said they would implement by the end of this year, if they've implemented it in the way that Microsoft has shipped it out of the box, and they haven't made many modifications to it, and I would expect Riot to modify it in some ways. League is a very different game that doesn't work the same way as Halo and shooters, like we talked about in the first video. So I would expect that Riot would have made significant changes to it, but it's definitely possible that as we see here, kill and death counts are being considered in addition to team win and loss. 2. When a player quits or drops out in the middle of a game, it is treated as a surrender, and their skill is updated as if they lost a game regardless of actual outcome. It's interesting because Riot actually implemented this a couple of years ago in terms of like if you would AFK and leave a game, it would count as a loss and you would lose LP regardless of the actual outcome of the game, and your teammates would benefit separately. And that's really interesting because that is something that they're specifically saying exists in Trueskill too. So that's interesting overlap that's the way that works now with AFKing in League. 3. A player's skill in a game mode is assumed statistically correlated with their skill in other modes, so that when a player starts a new mode, their skill rating from other modes is borrowed. So this was different, right? We read up here, for example, that a player's skill in a game mode is independent of their skill in all other modes. They're changing that so that they assume that there's some correlation between modes, which is sort of true, but has its limitations, right? Like, for example, in normal games, if somebody is tryharding super hard in normal games and everyone else is playing for fun and trying new champions because it's not supposed to matter, not supposed to affect your rank, you have a really weird disincentive of outcomes where some people are playing normal games for fun or to troll or to try new stuff or to try a weird build or whatever. And this one guy who's like leveling his account for the first time is trying really hard because he knows it has implications for his ranked value. And so he's both being trolled by his teammates because they're not playing for the same thing. And he's like able to, beat up on the opponents that aren't trying as hard in order to get a better placement, even though he doesn't necessarily deserve it because of how that is. Now, again, as I've said over and over again, if he were to place too high because of it, he would eventually just not win 50% of his games and fall back down. But, it's a scary prospect because, people aren't trying in normals. Then you look at a game mode like ARAM, and I think ARAM is so different from normals or from regular League that I wouldn't really say that ARAM or these other modes besides normal games they should really have no bearing on it. And I'm not really sure if they do, but like we talked about before, players were using ARAM sometimes to level accounts, and Riot was trying to use that data, I do believe, in order to help place new accounts in a more appropriate rank because it was sometimes all they had, and that seems really bad. So, because again, people are also trolling and doing for fun builds in ARAM, and the mode is like so completely different, doesn't include so many of the skills that are important for being good at regular Summoner's Rift League. Plus, like all the champions have like damage buffs and nerfs and stuff like that in ARAM, so it's really weird. Okay, so 4, the random walk of player's skill is assumed bias towards increasing skill, with larger bias during the first matches a player plays in a game mode. So this is different as well because, as we said, it says that a player can get better or worse kind of randomly. And this says, no, players tend to get better over time. That might actually be true. And so I think that that's actually probably a better assumption. Because players don't really randomly get way worse than they were at the game. You kind of have like a skill floor, And yes, the game can change over time and you can slowly decay your skill, but it's not very fast. So players don't really suddenly get a lot worse. In League, you can learn something and then suddenly be a better player at the game, or like learn something and then it takes you a very short period of time, relatively, like 10 or 20 games to implement that thing that you learned. So you might, learn something in one of my YouTube videos and then start practicing it. And then after 20 games, it's like ingrained in your gameplay. Or you might come up with something that you see that you're doing wrong in your games and start working on that thing and implementing it. Then after 10 or 20 games, it's ingrained in your gameplay. All of the sudden, your skill level is going to jump up a little bit. So I definitely think that players are on an upward trajectory over time, most of the time, rather than potentially just as likely to go down as they are to go up. When a player is part of a squad, their performance is assumed to be better than normal. This is also something, right, that we see in the way that Riot's matchmaking works, is that they decided that, if you're duoing, the average MMR of the other team should be slightly higher than your team to account for the communication advantage that you have as a duo, or the synergy that you have, or the ability to pick champions together that are more synergistic or better together, or be able to build comps and stuff like that. So all of these advantages that you have by playing as a duo, they do try to counteract by putting you in games with a higher MMR. It's a weird problem and a consequence of that, though, which is, one, it can be really frustrating when you're trying to duo with a friend and you're not that good. And so like what ends up happening is actually it just makes your games a lot harder. And so if you've ever gotten the feeling that, like, hey, when I duo with this guy who's the same rank as me, it gets really hard to win the game. And it's not that he's playing particularly bad or that I think he's a bad player, but when I duo it like feels harder to win ranked than it does when I play solo. That's why, and it's true. And I think that that's unfortunate, because you do want to be able to potentially play with your friend. And on the flip side of this, there's another issue, which is if you're able to win, like if you're a good duo and you're able to win, even if you're just winning 50% of your games, because you're playing at a higher MMR than you would normally be playing at, your MMR by winning 50% of your games with your duo is going up, because you're winning 50% of your games, or more than 50% of your games, at a higher MMR. It's kind of like playing those normal games with your friends who have high normal game MMR on their main account when you're leveling a Smurf. And so you get super high normal game MMR from playing those games with them and winning those games with them, because you're proving that you can win in that MMR. Well, a player playing solo wouldn't have the chance to prove that they can win an extra 20, 30, 40, 50 MMR higher unless they had to win some games first. So to be able to play with a duo, and then automatically, if you're winning 50+% of your games, you're showing that you can win at a higher elo, is really good for your MMR. And then if you stop playing with them or something like that and you go back, then it's a whole different thing. So that is one implication from duoing as well. Let's see. So I agree, though, that when a player is part of a squad, their performance is assumed to be better than normal. I think that that's a good assumption. 2, classic Trueskill. So this is probably going to be a summary, hopefully a better summary than actually going through that Trueskill 1 paper. So this is hopefully going to be a recap or a summary of what the classic Trueskill was like before they get into how they changed it. Okay, 2, classic Trueskill. This section describes the classic Trueskill model in detail and sets the notation used in the rest of the paper. In the classic Trueskill model, the data is assumed to be consistent of a sequence of match results, each of which lists the players involved, their team assignments, the start time and length of the match, how long each player played, and the final score of each team. The team scores are only used to determine an ordering of best to worst, including ties. Now, when they talk about team scores, keep in mind that this was designed for like Halo. So it's like game modes, like capture the flag where you get points, or like domination where you like get points for holding, points for a certain period of time or whatever. And so in League, this is going to be implemented obviously in a different way than they're talking about in the paper, since in the paper they're mostly talking about the way that this would relate to like a Halo or something like that. And League is a big enough game with enough money that I'm sure that they would both work with Microsoft in order to implement a version of this that works well with League. And potentially Riot would, be working on designing their own version of this, or with some slight variations and stuff like that make it better for a MOBA. To interpret this data, Trueskill assumes a probabilistic generative model of match results. This means that instead of experimenting with different formulas for updating a player's skill rating and hoping to stumble upon the right one, we construct an intuitive random process for generating skills and match results. This model can be checked against data and refined based on any discrepancies we encounter. When we are happy with the fit to the data, we apply Bayesian inference to obtain an optimal algorithm for updating skill ratings. The generative process is illustrated below, where boxes denote variables that are observed from the data. Past skill goes to skill. Skill results in a certain performance, and the skill of all of these different players and all of their different performances result in the team's performance versus the other team's performance. So this would be mirrored on the other side, and it results in a winner. The first step of the generative process is generating the player skills. Each player I is assumed to have real valued skill, denoted skill I at time t. The initial skill of a player is drawn from a Gaussian distribution with a mean M0 and variance V0. This sampling process is denoted blah blah blah. Skill I of skill of player I, or skill of player I at time 0 is approximately n as a function of M0 and V0, where T0 is the time of the player's first match, and M0, V0 are tunable parameters. After each match, the player's skill changes by a random amount, also drawn from a Gaussian. Note that we are talking about the player's actual skill level, not their skill rating assigned by the system. In the original paper, Herbrich et al. 2007, this was the only way that a player's skill could change. A later paper, Dan Gauthier et al. 2008, made the alternative assumption, also made by Glickman in 1999, that a player's skill changed with the passage of time rather than from playing matches. Both of these assumptions make sense, since a player gains experience from each match they play, and their sharpness decreases over time without play. Therefore, we include both types of change in the classic model. The next step of the generation process is generating the match results from the player skills. So this is interesting, actually, because they're saying that skill is a function of time. And this is really important. That actually means, when I say decay here, because I'm going to use the word decay, I don't mean like your account decaying from its rank, but this means, this is actually a pretty big implication, which is they're saying that they use time, and if a bunch of time goes by, and let's say you're not playing the game, it sounds like potentially under the Trueskill model, your skill rating would decline over time since you didn't play. And if that's the case, then that would have huge implications for like going on a vacation and not playing League and stuff for a long time, or skipping a split and stuff like that, which Riot has somewhat encouraged people to do now with how many splits there are. This seems like not I don't know. This is very interesting here. Both of these assumptions make sense, so they're both included. The next step of the generative process is generating the match results from player skills. Trueskill assumes that each player has a real valued performance in each match, drawn according to performance at time t is a function, or performance of player I at time t is about n as a function of skill of player I at t time, and beta squared, where beta is a tunable parameter that reflects the amount of randomness in the game. In the following, again, beta randomness, variance, it's or essentially like other. In the following, we drop the dependence of performance I on T, since we are always referring to a specific match. In a two-player game without draws, the winner is the player with the largest performance. If draws are possible, then the model includes a parameter of something, whatever that little thing is greater than 0, and declares a match to be drawn if the difference between the performances is less than or equal to whatever that little variable is. But we don't have ties in League. The outcome between two teams is decided in the same way as above. If the game has more than two teams and no possibility of draws, then we sort the teams by their performances to get their ordering. If a game has more than two teams and allows draws, then things get more complicated. Well, we definitely don't need this. In practice, this model for draws gives similar skill ratings as the approach and blah, blah, blah. Again, no, we don't have to worry about the draws. There is a scale ambiguity in this model, in the sense that if we scale all skill variables by 2, along with beta and whatever that other little one is, then the distribution over team orderings is the same. We resolve this ambiguity by fixing beta to 1. That means that a skill gap of 1 always corresponds to the same win rate. The amount of luck in a game is reflected in the size of V0, where smaller V0 implies more luck is involved. In a two-player game, so for example, a game like Hearthstone has a fair bit of luck in terms of like card drawing and stuff like that. Certainly a more lucky game than a game like League. But in a game like League, you do have some crazy variance with like how the game can go and like start out, and just people kind of like ships in a night running into each other in Fog of War and stuff like that. Things can get pretty random and pretty wild. And you know, but it's certainly, I would say, less random or less RNG than a game like Hearthstone or something like that. And so they're saying that, you know, they can apply this volatility to this equation. Thus, M0 is irrelevant in such game. Oh, maybe we skipped something. In a two-player game, there is also a shift ambiguity in the model, in the sense that if we add 2 to all skills, then the distribution over outcomes is the same. Thus, M0 is irrelevant in such games. However, in a team game where teams may have different sizes, for example, due to players dropping out, we don't have to worry about this in League, M0 is relevant since it represents the value of having a teammate. Note that this model does not generate the entire match result. It generates the ordering of teams given the players in the match, their team assignments, the length of the match, and the length of each time each player played. So keep in mind that the reason why it keeps talking about the length of time each player played is like for a game like Halo, where a player can just like leave in the middle of the match and that's acceptable. In League, we also don't have to worry about this because people aren't leaving in the middle of the game. They do sometimes actually leave during the middle of the game. And I do wonder if in those rare cases where people leave, if Riot uses a system to take that into account, that like, hey, like your performance. So this would be an advantage. Like if they were using Trueskill 2 like this, if you had an AFK on your team, it would take into account how long that AFK was gone for, and use that to determine that you shouldn't lose as much MMR because you lost this certain value for having a teammate for a long time. So it's not true that actually that we don't have to worry about it in League. Of course, anyone can leave. It's just a rarer problem in League, let's say. Okay, where are we at here? Note that this doesn't generate the entire match, does not generate the set of players that will be in the match, the team assignments, the time of the match, the length of the match, or the length of time each player played. However, most of these things are correlated with skill. For example, a person who plays in the middle of the day is more likely to be a dedicated player with a higher skill. That's true. Due to skill-based matchmaking, a player on the opposite team as a skilled player is more likely to be skilled themselves. Well, yeah, yes. From a purely statistical perspective, including those correlations in the model would give better skill estimates, but Trueskill does not do this because it would create undesirable incentives for players who want to increase their skill rating by like playing at certain times. The incentive should be to play the game well, not to queue up at particular times of day or with particular teammates. Fair enough. In a skill-based matchmaking system, it's really hard to try to queue with particular teammates, though. Like, if you're a silver player, you can try to queue snipe Tyler 1. You're not getting into his game, you know? So I don't know. It would be difficult for you to try to coordinate matching with a higher set of players. Although certainly possible. I mean, at the higher end of the spectrum where ranked is the most important, it is possible, for example, that if you could see when the rank 1 player, you know, so like if you're in Challenger, it is possible that you could see when the rank 1 player is queuing up by stalking their op.gg, or especially if you have them added as a friend, and then you could like stalk them and then try to queue up when they're queuing up. And for example, if you don't play the same role as them, you're just as likely to have them on your team as they are to be on the other team. Maybe slightly more likely to be on the other team if in the event of an autofill, for example, but definitely about 50-50 chance anyways that they'll be on your team or the other team, but you get to play in a higher MMR game by sniping that person. So they don't want to over incentivize that. The only difficulty is that of course I think I just came up with a new strategy for very high elo, which is actually in League it doesn't really matter because you can already do that, because if you try to keep playing with like the rank 1, rank 2, rank 3 players over and over again, you will be in higher average MMR games if you're at a rank where you're able to snipe them, and if you're winning a decent portion of those games, that should actually help you, I think. And there's not really a way to change that because then you'd have to be changing that, like playing against a team with higher MMR, playing with a team of higher MMR is like doesn't help your MMR go up, but that's not possible in a skill-based system. That's definitely important to take into account. But anyways, yeah, you don't want people to queue in the middle of the day. It is true that like if you're queuing in the middle of the day, you're you know, potentially more likely to be a higher rated player. I don't disagree with that, but you wouldn't want people queuing in the middle of the day to trick them into thinking that your job is to play League and so you're good at it. You know. Blah, blah, blah. Let's see. The fact that Trueskill does not model the length of time a player played is questionable. If a player tends to quit in the middle of a match, then this should arguably be reflected in their skill rating. On the other hand, if a player joins a match in progress, so basically what they're saying, let's take a game like Halo. Now, obviously in League, if you keep doing this, you would get banned. So it's not a strategy, right? But like in a game like Halo, so take Halo 2, right? When they originally had the Trueskill 1 system, a player could decide that the match was going very poorly and leave that match, but play out all of the matches in which they're winning. And the result would be that because it's not taking into account that they're leaving the games and the amount of time that they spend in the game, the result would be that they would be playing more often in winning scenarios. And if they're playing more often, getting better KDA in winning scenarios and winning more games, then obviously the player who left those losing games in Halo and only played the winning ones would have a higher rating than the other person. And that's not really fair. In fact, the player who maybe has more experience from playing all of the losses, actually knows how to come back from a losing situation, is arguably potentially a better player, right? So obviously this would be a good improvement that it takes that into account, not something that really affects League too much though. Let's see. Trueskill treats both cases in the same way. If a player quits early in the match, then time played will be small, so the player will have a negligible change to their skill rating, which may even be positive if their team happens to win. One way to penalize quitters is to artificially set time played to the full length of the game. This penalizes the quitter, but also harshly penalizes players on the same team. This becomes worse when a new player joins to replace the quitter. Since the quitter is considered to have played for the full time, the team is considered to have more players than normal and therefore expected to win. If the team doesn't win, all remaining players, including the late joiner, get large reductions in skill rating. Therefore, we don't recommend this approach for team games. Trueskill 2 provides a better way to penalize quitters, as discussed in Section 9. Computer skill ratings. Given a probabilistic generative model for match results, skill ratings are computed by Bayesian inference. Formally, the model defines a joint distribution over player skills and match results, conditional on the unmodeled aspect of each match, which we will abbreviate as match conditions. The distribution over player skills comes from Bayes' rule. Probability of skills result as a function probability as a function of skills results conditions equals the probability of results skills conditions times the probability of skills divided by the probability as a function of results and conditions. In practice, we don't compute the entire joint distribution over skills, but only the marginal distribution of skill, the skill of player I at time t for all I and t. This distribution is approximated by a Gaussian, and the mean of that Gaussian is taken as the player's skill rating. There are a variety of algorithms available for performing Bayesian inference, but this model is particularly suited to expectation propagation, Minka 2001, Herbrich et al. 2007, and Dan Gauthier et al. 2008. Used the expectation propagation algorithm and gave a factor graph with message equations. In this work, we used the infer.net framework, Minka et al. 2014, to generate code for expectation propagation automatically, based on our model description. This generated code performs message passing on a factor graph as described in the Herbrich et al. 2007. And produces the same results as in that paper. Infer.net generated both the online and batch versions of the inference algorithm. In fact, Trueskill through time is one of the examples in the Infer.net documentation, Minka et al. 2014. To generate the online Trueskill updates, we defined a model in Infer.net consisting of a single match. The prior distributions on the player skills, the match conditions, model parameters, and team ranks were marked as observed variables, and the player skills were marked as variables to infer. Infer.net then generated a code where the observed variables were the input and the inferred skill distributions were the output. This code is used to compute skill ratings in the following ways. 1. Initialize all player skill distributions to a Gaussian with a mean M0 and variance V0. 2. For each match result in order of start time, A. Look at the current skill distribution for each player in the match. B. Increase the variance of each skill distribution according to the amount of time elapsed since the player's last match, and equation. So this is important because this is what we were talking about last time. Trueskill 2 is going to assume that because a lot of time has elapsed since your last match, that your variance and your skill distribution is different than it used to be, probably worse. So there's an element of decay, right? They assume that there's a skill decay over time, which I think is accurate, but poses big implications because when you come back to a game of League after having not played in a while, not only are you rustier, but now you're having to adjust to a different level of play than you were used to playing at before, which I find to be quite difficult personally. And so that can really affect how you feel and how your games are like when you come back into playing a game of League if they've implemented something like this. And again, Riot did say that they were planning on implementing a version of Trueskill 2 in the game by the end of 2024 or by the end of season 14, and it may already be implemented. I'm personally convinced that it's already implemented because of the evidence that I've seen from certain accounts that I've played on. It just seems like it's using more than win and loss data because of that example that I gave in the first video. It seems like it's using more than win and loss data in order to rank a player up more quickly to their appropriate rank. So, this is very interesting. Maybe I won't want to take a break as much, knowing that it would decrease the matchmaking skill assumptions. Invoke the inference code on the match result and skill distributions to get a new set of skill distributions. These represent each player's skill during the match. D. Increase the variance of each skill distribution according to 2 to represent a possible change in skill as a result of playing the match. So, and E, store the new skill distribution for each player in the match. The online Trueskill updates are useful as a fast, real-time approximation to the posterior distribution over skills, but the most accurate skill ratings come from processing many matches together as a batch. To see why, consider 5 matches between 6 players played in this order. A beats B, C beats D, E beats F, B beats C, D beats E. All players start with the same skill distribution. After the first 3 matches, players A, C, and E have all won 1 match against equivalent opponents, so the online updates will give them the same skill distribution. Similarly, players B, D, and F get the same skill distribution. In the last 2 matches, B and D started with the same skill distribution and beat opponents with the same skill distribution, so they end up with the same final skill distribution. Similarly, C and E end up with the same skill distribution, but this is clearly wrong. If we consider all matches together, the players should be ordered A, B, C, D, E, F. To generate the batch Trueskill algorithm, we defined a model in infer.net that included the entire generation process described in section 2. Each player had a skill variable skill for every match they played. This is many more variables than Dan Gothier et al. 2008, who used 1 skill variable for each year of play. The generated code takes as input a list of match results and outputs a Gaussian distribution for each skill variable. The handling of model parameters is discussed in section 4. The difference between online and batch inference is illustrated on real data below. So this is kind of important. This is kind of like, I think what they're getting at is that one, there's this problem with like intransitivity. Transitivity would be the idea that like if A is better than B and B is better than C, then A has to be better than C. But part of the issue is that in a skill-based game, especially with different champion matchups and different things like that, it's not always the case that this is the case. Sometimes Team A is better than Team B, and Team B is better than Team C, but Team C is actually better than Team A. Because of whatever reason they match up better against them or something like that. And so you get a result that is much more even between the 3 teams than you would initially expect. And it sounds like what they're able to do here, which would be really cool if they could do this, is essentially rather than your MMR, your skill level, being reflected by just winning that one game versus that one player at that time and then updating once, but if it's able to essentially kind of continuously re-update, then it could do, I mean, there's kind of incredible implications here actually, which is, let's say hypothetically, and I don't know if this is exactly what this is getting at, but I'll give you a really crazy example. Hypothetically, let's say you have a player who's on a Smurf account and that player plays in your game and you lose to that player And when you played, you had pretty similar MMR to each other because you were able to match into the same game in the first place. But obviously, that Smurf player goes on to win a huge percentage of their games and peaks in Diamond 4, let's say. Now, if you were the gold player who went up against that Diamond 4 player, maybe your skill rating would not just stay, as a result of that match you lost like 20 mmr, but maybe over time, as the skill rating of that other player became more apparent to the system, it could go back and update how much mmr you gained or lost from that one game, to account for the fact that that player was actually really like a diamond level player. Now that's very tricky and difficult because did the player improve after you played against them? Were they really a diamond level player when you played against them? If these things are constantly updating, is your rank just going to like randomly fluctuate all over the place? Are you going to experience like, could players experience like a downward swing even though they're playing like totally the same? They experience some huge downward swing as their older matches are updated to reflect the fact that they actually had easier older matches? Or, are players going to experience wild upward swings all of a sudden without any real change in their skill because their MMR is updating upwards because of a lot of their matches leaned the other direction where people were smurfing in their old matches? Very interesting, but certainly not something I had thought about before. But yeah, if you could somehow, you know, like post match, change the amount of MMR that you're gaining, or basically look at what they're saying here is you're looking at all of the wins and losses you took against all of the players that you played against, and then it's able to update those as a result of that other player beating somebody else or losing to somebody else, rather than it just remaining constant. But I do worry that the further away you get from that original game that you played, that the worse this would be, because obviously the player could have gotten better or worse since you last played against them. So imagine all of the sudden that like a player you played against like a year ago, is suddenly like doing really well. It might be totally independent of you, right? So for example, a player might have moved, this happened to me, right? Like I was a D4 player and then I moved to the Midwest. My ping went way, way down. And then I ended up winning and getting to Masters. So like if I played against somebody in Diamond 4, are all of those people I beat in Diamond 4 who like I beat when I was a Diamond 4 player and they were Diamond 4 players and like they deserve to take that full loss, are they suddenly going to lose less for those games from a full year ago because I've improved as a player and because my ping got better? Or is it crazy to say that that person should just stay totally the same? Now, obviously, you would want to build, if you're doing something like this, some sort of time slash number of matches played from the original game. So maybe it would only update based on how the next 10 games from that person went or something like that. So that you don't get that kind of crazy scenario I'm talking about. That way it would be like, okay, well, it turns out this guy won 9 out of his next 10 games because he was smurfing and ended up being like a plat plus MMR player. So we can compensate those silver and gold players that played against them as a result of that. That would be interesting for sure. And maybe that would be a little bit better. But anyway, so really interesting implications from this one. I'm not really even sure that's what that was talking about, though. The number of matches, let's see. The data was 700,000 Halo 5 Slayer matches, and skill ratings were computed for all players. Out of this large set of players, the figures show the skill ratings over the same 6 players versus the number of matches each one played. The skill ratings from batch immediately stand out as being smoother, but more importantly, they give a final ordering of players with red below green and black far below blue. So here we have some players over a number of matches, and they're getting a much more consistent skill rating by looking at batch data as opposed to looking at how their skill rating It's quite strange. I don't really know what to make of this. Huh. Parameter estimation. The classic Trueskill model has tunable parameters. M0, V0, I forget what that squiggly is, I forget what that squiggly is, beta, and I forget what that squiggly is for each game mode. To make the skill rating system easy to use by Game Studio, these should be learned from the data. Previous work tuned these parameters by sweeping over a grid, which is only practical for a small number of parameters on a small dataset. Since our goal is to extend the model with more parameters and run on large datasets, we need a different solution. Our approach is to treat the model parameters as random variables in the model, giving them prior distributions and inferring them jointly with the skills. In practice, we gave the parameters broad priors, so they were mainly determined by the data. Our initial approach was to infer the parameters with expectation propagation. Unfortunately, most parameters are involved in generating every match result, which means that in the factor graph, a given parameter will be connected to millions of factors. This leads to a high memory requirement, as a large number of messages need to be stored. In addition, the posterior distribution for some parameters is highly non-Gaussian, leading to poor approximations and sometimes non-convergence of the algorithm. Our final approach exploits the fact that each parameter connects to a million factors. In such a model, the parameter will tend to have a sharp posterior distribution. Therefore, we choose to drop the uncertainty in the parameter posteriors and approximate them as point masses during each iteration. This not only saves memory on messages, but also saves computation. At the end of each iteration, we update each parameter using our prop, Reed, Miller, and Braum. I read it as Braum. It's Braun, 1993, where the gradient is computed by accumulating the expectation propagation messages into that parameter. The incoming messages are computed once and discarded. This procedure reaches reasonable parameter estimates in about 100 iterations, i.e. 100 forward and backward sweeps through the data. Note that this approximation breaks down for game modes with less than 1,000 matches. For such modes, we use the parameter estimation from the most similar popular mode. For the Halo 5 data, typical parameter values are M0 equals 3. Teammates are very important. So this is the effect of having a teammate. V0, 1.6. Skills of new players only vary by 1 from the mean. This one, can we look up what this is? Probably not. Gamma, uppercase or lowercase, is the third letter of the Greek alphabet, which does what in math? Whatever. We still didn't get an answer after looking that all up. Besides, they're going to explain it anyways. Skills change pretty slowly, basically. Something minutes of non-player equivalent to 1 match. We don't have to worry about that much in League. Beta is 1 by design. And draws are rare. Metric-driven modeling. This section describes the approach that was used to develop the Trueskill 2 model. The motivation behind it is that a skill rating system should use the simplest model that meets the needs of a game studio. I beg this question to Riot. If they admit in the Trueskill 2 paper that the simplest rating system should be used, why use this complicated rating system instead of just using the ELO system? Even if it's a little bit slower to get people to the appropriate rank, you can be so transparent with it that people will have faith that they are playing a highly competitive game with an appropriate skill-based rating system that does a great job of rating them. When you have a skill-based rating system developed by a bunch of PhDs using Greek and complicated statistics that even someone who I've read through these problem sets before in college, and it's not good. Um, you know, it's too complicated for people to understand. And so even someone like me with a recent math background, if I can't, if I took the time to look up what all the Greek letters meant and stuff like that again, maybe I could understand what's going on a little bit better. And I have the general idea, right? We have the gist of what's going on. But it's so complicated that if they could just have an ELO system where, like I said, you gain about 20 ELO or MMR when you win, you lose about 20 ELO or MMR when you lose. If the team is a little bit better than you, you gain a little bit more. If the team's a little bit worse than you, you gain a little bit less. If you lose against a team that's a little bit worse than you, you lose a little bit more. If you lose versus a team that's a lot better than you, you lose a little bit less. We're talking 18 to 22. If you just introduce a system like that, show people their number, you will immediately take a huge percentage of the player base that is skeptical about how rank works, that thinks that they're stuck in a rank because of this unfair algorithm that exists in rating players. And you're going to disprove them all and make new players and players who might be interested in playing a competitive game understand that it's not some engagement-based matchmaking. It's not some complicated skill-based matchmaking that takes all these other factors besides winning and losing into account. Instead, it's just a simple, straightforward matchmaking system. And so I'd almost prefer just using the ELO system, even if it's a little bit slower to place people in the appropriate rank. I would rather use the ELO system. Everyone starts out at a fair playing field. It's simple enough and easy enough for people to understand exactly how it works. You can show people their rating and then ban smurfing so that you don't have to worry about the system being slow at putting really high rated players into into an appropriate rank before they ruin all the low elo players games. You just do that, right? And then you don't have this problem. You create a very honest, transparent, and open competitive game, and you dispel all of these concerns within the community about the rank system. So anyways, I have to go on a rant because they say the motivation behind it is that a skill rating system should use the simplest model that meets the needs of a game studio. We shouldn't have to spend large amounts of time searching for that model. The basic principle is that any change to the model must be motivated by a metric that demonstrates a gap between the model and reality. This metric must be meaningful to the application and specific enough that it is clear why the model needs to be changed in order to improve the metric. We call this approach metric-driven modeling. Taking inspiration from test-driven development of computer software, the metrics encode a deep understanding of the application. While modeling is in principle a mechanical search for ways to improve the metrics, a metric is a function averaged over a subset of test data. It can refer to the data, inferences from the model, or the differences between an inference and the data. Data subsets are defined using features. The metric designer's job is to determine the relevant subsets and comparisons. In principle, this does not require knowledge of the model. Metrics should be in data space, or more generally, the external interface of the model, not in the parameter space. For a generative model of match results, the key metric is how well it predicts the final ordering of teams. We call this the predictive accuracy. For matches with two teams, there are only 3 possible orderings. With more teams, the number of possible orderings grows exponentially. To get a meaningful and easily computable metric, we only ask the model to predict the identity of the winning team or to predict draw when there is a tie for first place. Thus, the number of options is the number of teams plus 1. Accuracy is useful for comparing models, but it doesn't tell you why errors were made. Is the model favoring certain kinds of teams or players? Does it penalize quitters too harshly or not enough? Does it overestimate the skill of new players or underestimate them? To answer these questions, we look at how often the model thinks that a particular kind of team or player would win compared to how often they actually win. The data used to develop Trueskill 2 was the set of all matches played in Halo 5 since its release in 2015, provided to us by 343 Industries. Halo 5 has a variety of game modes which span various numbers of teams and sizes. This dataset contains millions of match results and millions of unique players. For the results shown in this paper, the training set consisted of 23 million games played just after release. The test set consisted of the next 3 million games played after the end of the training period. Because of the large size of this dataset, there is no need to report error bars in our summary statistics since they are tiny. All metrics, including predictive accuracy, were measured in the following way. For each model, the parameters were tuned on the training set. Then the model was asked to predict the outcomes in the test set. The player's skills were reset between the train and test phase. Resetting the player's skills is not essential, but made the implementation simpler. The matches in the test set were sorted by start time and processed once in order. As each match was processed, we asked the model to predict the winning team and give a probability for this event. When making this prediction, only the team composition and squad membership are used. The length of the game, time each player played, completion status, and kill/death counts are not used. Then we updated the skills using the online updater with all of the information available at the end of the match. The percentage of correct predictions is the predictive accuracy, and the percentage of matches where a particular kind of team or player was predicted to win is the expected win rate. Many of our metrics involve the expected win rate of a subpopulation of players. This is computed by recording the prediction for all matches, visiting each player in each match, and testing if the player meets the criteria. If so, the prediction for that player's team is added to the tally. The final metric is an average of the predictions for all players that met the criteria. Thus, the subpopulation that we define only changes a subset of predictions that go into the average. It does not change how we make predictions or update skills. Skills are always updated using all matches. After tuning model parameters on the training data, Classic Trueskill achieved a predictive accuracy of 52% on the test set. Trueskill 2 achieved a predictive accuracy of 68% on the test set. The next sections explain how this was accomplished. The figure below illustrates the new generative model in Trueskill 2, where the boxes denote variables that are observed in the data compared to section 2. So I wanted to read here, it said that they didn't use certain things. When making this prediction, what prediction? As each match was processed, we asked the model to predict the winning team and give a probability. When making this prediction, only the team composition and squad membership are used. The length of the game, time each played, completion status, and kill death counts are not used. Okay. So again, we have the same chart from before, which is you have past skill, and then we also have experience is feeding into skill. And then there's a question about whether these players are in a squad or not together. And then that feeds into their performance, whether they're in a squad or not, and based on their skill. And then you get a team performance versus the other team's performance, and then you get a winner. But we're also looking at kill count, death count, and whether the player quit or not as some basic metrics to kind of compare the performance of one team to the other team. 6. Squad offset. Many online multiplayer games give friends the option of queuing up together. We call such a grouping a squad. The matchmaker is expected to find a fair match where the entire squad is on one team. This is typically done by assuming that the skill rating of a squad is the sum of skill rating of its players. We can test this assumption by measuring an appropriate metric. The metric we chose partitions players according to whether they queued up for a squad versus solo, and measures their actual win rate compared to their predicted win rate under the assumption. This was done regardless of game mode, and the results on the test are collected below. So the bigger the squad, the bigger the win rate, and Trueskill was kind of being thrown off by the squad win rate. We see that the assumptions about squads is false. This was the initial assumption that the old system started with, which is that squads don't have this big effect. The skill rating of a squad should be larger than the sum of its players, and the effect grows with the size of the squad. This is a well-known phenomenon in online gaming. In fact, some playlists in Halo 5 and Gears of War 4 prohibit large squads in an attempt to provide fair matches, even though this lowers the enjoyment of people who like to play with their friends. Other games address this by forcing squads to match with other squads. So let's talk about League for a second. So obviously, League is a game that could be played with up to 5 people, and people would probably like to play with a large group of 5 people with a friend group, as they initially do when they start playing normal games, as opposed to playing ranked by themselves or with only 2 people. And yet Riot prohibits you from doing that. This is going to be a video topic that I will get into another day, especially because this is already taking a ton of time. But I definitely think that League needs to provide a competitive mode that allows people to play together as a team, because that allows for the most accurate representation of competitive skill level at the game. It's like if baseball was only ever played with random people being thrown together, right? Obviously, the strength in a team-based game or sport comes from how good you are at cooperating with other people. And if you're just cooperating with random people that you don't have the ability to communicate with, that's completely different. It's a whole different game than having to get good with other players over time, to adjust to their play style, to play around the same people, and to communicate well with those people and things like that. That's the nature of what competitive League is all about. That's why you see some players who have proven, that they're good enough mechanically that they could potentially play against the best of the best. They're not going to get solo killed over and over and over again against any other professional player. Like maybe a couple of times if they're having a really rough game and they're like the 10th best LCS player playing versus the first best LCS player in that role. But for the most part, like they're going to be, skilled enough at the game that at most they're dying like 1 or 2 times, solo kill or something like that to, the best ranking opponent they could go up against. And so they're skillful enough that if they're like, decent in solo queue, they're like a GM/challenger-ish player, maybe, like challenger, but, they don't have to be rank 1. They're decent enough that how good they are as a competitive player comes down to their communication, their ability to work with their team, even their ability to get along with their teammates over a long period of time, working in a team environment, so that they can enable their teammates to play better, to improve, to be in a better attitude and state of mind, rather than being like mauling at each other all the time, right? So this is why there's a difference, and we see a lot of competitive players maybe not being the best solo queue players. Another reason, which is also very important, is to understand that competitive players, once they become pros, don't have time to play as many solo queue games as they would need to play to be at the top of their game. And there's also an effect, right, where if you're used to being able to rely on your teammates to a certain extent, or you're used to a certain player playing a certain way for you all the time in scrims, which are like most of your matches that you're playing as a pro, and then you go into solo queue and you can't communicate with your teammates, even though that's one of your biggest strengths as a player, you can't coordinate decisions and things like that very easily as a team. It feels like if you're going from masters to silver or whatever, and it's like, yes, you should be able to win because the players are a little bit worse, and yes, you probably will over time if you have enough games and you adjust, but it can feel really bad and be tough to adjust. And so in the short term, it may actually be quite bad for you in solo queue, because you might go into solo queue and mauled about how discoordinated it is and how terrible it is compared to playing with your team, and you might not bother, or you might not adjust to it very well. So that's one of the reasons why we see that. But obviously it would be good then to have a mode in League where people are either playing solo, or to have a mode where people are playing as a 5-man. And so I definitely want to talk about like bringing a 5-man team mode back to League. I know we have flex queue, it's just not the same. It's no good. So they need to bring something else back. But that's a video for another time. Now on this other point, matching squads versus squads, This is a good way to deal with the problem. But there needs to be, in my opinion, more of a guarantee that this is happening. And especially in a game like League, where certain roles have certain synergy with each other or can play better with each other, like support and AD carry, or jungle and mid, or jungle and support. These certain combinations are obviously better than like an AD carry duoing with the top laner, or like a support duoing with the top laner, or something like that. And so these combinations of duos that are more impactful, like let's say that you throw a top laner and a support duoing with each other into a game, and on the other team there's like a support and a jungler, or a support and an AD carry duoing together. Well, that's not actually as balanced as you think that it is, because just because there's duo on each side and the MMR of the game is similar doesn't mean that the random support and AD carry with each other aren't going to get outplayed over time. On average, they're going to get outplayed and do worse than the coordinated bot duo from the other team. And so that needs to be taken into account too. But anyways, so moving on, you got the squads. Let's see. Other games address this by forcing squads to match with other squads, but this has the problem of shrinking the matchmaking pool. Instead of prohibiting squads or constraining matchmaking, Trueskill 2 changes the assumptions about the skill ratings of squads. This new assumption should be used during matchmaking as well as after a match when updating their skill ratings. There are a variety of different models that one could imagine, but in keeping with the metric-driven model, we chose the simplest model that fixes the metrics in the above table. This model simply adds an offset to the skill rating of a player depending on the size of their squad when generating the player's performance. So essentially they're saying, based off this data we collected, we're going to assume that a squad, depending on how many more people it has in it, for League, obviously you can only be solo or duo for solo queue, but you may use this in flex, in determining flex ratings. Basically what we're saying is that we know how much better you're going to get as a duo, and we're going to use that information in order to match you against harder opponents like League does, and give you less MMR for a win, because we're assuming that you're better. So actually I talked about this earlier, and this would take that away, which is the idea that if you get to win at a higher MMR, even if you're just winning 50-50, it will like increase or boost your MMR as opposed to just playing solo, because you get to be in higher MMR games. But actually it won't do that, because it's adjusting your skill rating at the end of a game based on the fact that it assumed that you were playing from a higher starting skill level anyways. So if you were to just win 50%, it wouldn't actually move you upwards just because you're playing in those higher MMR games, which is a good thing. Okay, so then they've got a little equation where, let's see. Therefore, equation 4 is replaced by blah, 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 where squad offset is an array of tunable parameters, one for each possible squad size for each game mode. We fix squad offset 1 to 0. To incorporate this change, we've updated the model description for infer.net, generated the new inference code automatically, and ran batch inference on the training set to infer the model parameters. On the sample test set as before, we get the following metric values. So now our Trueskill 2 system is able to better predict the expected win percentage of these squads of different sizes. It's actually still underestimating it a little bit, which is interesting to say, but it is doing a better job of estimating it. We cannot change the matchmaking in historical data, so the actual win rates are unchanged, but the model now predicts close to the correct win rates, implying that its skill ratings for squads are more accurate. 7. Experience effects. Interesting. So this is really interesting. I don't even know what this talks about yet, but one thing that I've tried to do a lot for myself as a player is I've kept track of, you know how op.gg, you can go to op.gg and see what your wins and losses are on each champion for a season. But I like to keep track of what my wins and losses are on a champion, not just for this season, but across all of the ranked games that I've ever played on the champion. And so I have a spreadsheet where I keep track of basically just adding these op.gg pages together so that I can see, okay, this is how many ranked games I've played on Braum total. And when I've gone to create a champion pool in seasons where I don't just want to play Braum and I want to play like 10 champions and like show that I can play more champions and stuff, I try to pick 10 champions. And I have two pieces of data. I have how many games I've played on the champion all time, and I have my win rate over those number of games. And there's something really interesting, which is that I truly believe that experience is one of the best metrics to use to figure out how good you're going to do on a champion. So, like, for example, let's just take a look at it because this is actually really interesting and they're probably about to get into a similar thing. Here we have, me playing Braum. Now I have a 52% win rate on Braum, like 52.7%. So that may sound like, hey, that's not really that good. But then you have to consider that my sample size is 4,411 games. So obviously it's going to be very difficult to win more than 50% of your games on 4,411 games because the rank system is always trying to put you at a 50% win rate. So that means that even at my peak, I'm still climbing constantly on Braum, which is actually a really good thing. And so what I've noticed here in looking at all this data over the years is that when you first start learning a champion, and this is for me, it could differ a little bit for other people, but when you first start learning a champion, as we can see here, when I have less than 100 games played, I almost always, you can see it here in yellow and red, almost always have less than a 50% win rate. It's very difficult to have more than a 50% win rate. So it's like in the very beginning when you play 1 or 2 games, even if you're not very experienced and not very good at the champion, you can kind of luck into like winning your first game or your first 2 games. Let me move my camera here. It's a little bit in the way. So if you've played 1 or 2 games, or even let's say 4, it's very possible to luck into winning 50+% of your games. Because even if you're not very experienced at the champion, it's possible to just luck into winning your first 2 or going 1-1 or going 2-2. But we see here very consistently that between let's say, 3 or 4 games played and even all the way up to 17, very consistently, it's impossible to be winning 50% of your game. Not impossible, right? But it's very difficult to be winning 50% of your games on a new champion when you've only played a couple of ranked games on the champion. You're very likely to lose most of your games. Then it gets a little bit better. So we can see in this section, let's call it 20 games or above, we start to see 50% win rate or above on maybe half of the champions that we're playing, possibly depending on how easy the champion is and how well suited we are to the type of champion that it is and that sort of thing. But we still see below a 50% win rate on probably most, or at least 50% of the champions that we're picking. Then, similar thing in here, really when we get to about, for me, and this is for me, and this tells you about how long it takes me to learn a champion. When I play about 100 games on a champion, there is a decent chance, about a 50% chance, that at 100 games played, I'm going to be able to win 50% of my ranked games on that champion, and so I'll be at a 50% win rate. Or I should say I'll be winning more than 50% of my games, and I'll have made up for all of the games that I lost earlier, and I'll be able to be at about a 50% win rate. So for me, about 100 games to, let's say, learn a champion at my peak rank. On some champions, though, it'll take a little bit more than 100 games. And so you can see that, I guess with this one exception, I'm back 1 game on Nautilus, above 130 games played, except for Nautilus and Thresh, and Nautilus I'm only 1 game back on. Every single champion I've played more than 120, 130 games on, I have more than a 50% win rate on. Now, Thresh, this comes down to Thresh being an extremely difficult champion to play, and me playing 400 Thresh games maybe less than that, maybe, but a lot of Thresh games when I was in silver back in season 4. And so I played a lot of Thresh, very complicated, one of the most complicated support champions, most difficult high skill ceiling support champions in the game. I played a lot of him when I was at a low rank, which made it very difficult for me to do well on the champion. And then with Nautilus, it's just like, it's just one game back. So I imagine that this will clean up once I played a few more games on Nautilus. Now, we can see even on Thresh, for example, that once, and this is interesting, I've broken it down here on this graph. You can see what it looks like what my stats are on these champions since I got to Diamond, whatever season that was. And you can see what my win rates are on champions and wins and losses in games played since I got to Masters. And what's interesting is a champion like Thresh, who was very difficult for me, and obviously I haven't done very well on. I've played 40 Thresh games in Masters, and I've gone 22-18 with a 55% win rate on 40 games. Maybe it's not the biggest sample size in the world, but I definitely say that something weird is going on where, wait a minute, even though my Thresh stats suggest that I should never touch the champion again overall, when you look at how I've performed since I became a better player, and since I've gained that experience previously on Thresh, I actually am winning well over 50% of my games, and it'd be totally fine for me to pick him in a Masters game if I wanted to. So that's a very interesting effect. But essentially what I'm noting here is that win rate is more of a function of games played than its own thing. And so they fall very neatly, and you can see it even for me as an individual player. When you color code these things like this, you can see how clear it is that you start off not winning 50% of your games on a champion, then you approach 50% at around 100 games played, and then once you clear 100 games played, usually on most champions I'm winning 50+% of my total games played, which means that with recency bias I'm winning more than 50% of my most recent games and stuff like that. So very interesting phenomenon there, right? But my point is that experience is king. So if I have 4,000 games of experience on Braum, am I going to be better at Braum or Leona even though I have a 55% win rate on Leona? The answer is that I'm better at Braum. Why is it that I'm better at Braum? Well, it's because I'm much more experienced, and I know for me that those Leona games were mostly when I was in Bronze in Season 3. So if hundreds of these Leona games came from when I was in Bronze, and I'm not as good at the champion right now as I used to be, and I was winning those games in a much lower, easier rank when I was climbing very hard, that's a big difference between when I was playing those Leona games and when I was playing the Braum games, which were both more recently, and when I was playing at my absolute peak, not when I was first starting my climb and going up a lot. And so I played Braum when I was hard stuck in Masters. I played Braum when I was hard stuck in Plat and Diamond. And so big difference there. So experience is really important. I'd like to even improve on this more by also setting it up, and I've kind of set myself up to do this. I've, in order to keep track of them here, I have these all these sets entered for each season, starting back when I first started playing ranked in Season 3. And what's interesting about that is I could actually set it up with some sort of decay where, I could say that games from Season 3 count for 10% of the value as a game from this split. And I could kind of create a recency bias that says, hey, my experience on these champions is important, but if I have, let's look at, I don't know, let's say I have 111 games played on Karma since I got to Masters. Even though I have a lot less games on Karma than some champions overall, like Thresh, for example. If I've played 111 games on Karma recently, but only 40 games on Thresh recently, probably better off picking Karma, whereas it might not be suggested like that here. So, you get the idea. So I could create a recency bias to say that my experience is more important when I'm at a higher rank and more important more recently to now, because if I haven't played Leona in 10 years, Now, I've played Leona recently too, but if I hadn't played Leona in like 10 years, or most of those games were 10 years ago, that recency bias in the data would allow me to better create a champion pool that's more reflective of that. So that's interesting. We're going to get into experience effects here. So a key priority of any game studio is ensuring that new players have an enjoyable first time with the game. Part of this is putting new players into fair matches, but this can only happen if the skill ratings assigned to new players are accurate. We measure this by partitioning players according to the number of matches that they previously played in any game mode. We call this their experience, and comparing their actual win rate to that expected under the Trueskill model. If a player has 0 games played, we can see that they have expected 49% win rate, but actually it's at 45%. But then as they move up to greater than or equal to 10 games played, their win rate moves up to more like 49%. And they're able to do what they did before with the previous thing, which was squads, and they're able to adjust. So we see that Trueskill is not predicting the correct win rate for new players. These results suggest that players tend to increase their skill as they play the game, with the largest increases happening at the beginning. It makes sense intuitively that skill is correlated with experience. However, the classic Trueskill model assumes that player skill changes according to a random walk, where upward and downward changes are equally likely. This suggests a simple change to the model to make the random walk biased. Let experience be the number of matches played in the current game mode before time t. In practice, we cap this at 200 to limit the number of parameters. Instead of equation 2, we use blah blah blah, where experience offset is an array of 200 tunable parameters per game mode. Operationally, this means that each player receives a small increment to their skill rating after playing a match, regardless of the outcome. These increments are small relative to the difference between winning and losing a match, so skill rating will still go down if a player loses repeatedly. See the table below, which shows the effects of adding these increments for players in the test set. So actually, Trueskill is underestimating new players now, but overall it is more accurate. So interesting. It's underestimating the squads compared to this. Like, it's not doing an accurate job of, well, it's doing a more accurate job, but it's underestimating the squad's win rate, especially as they get really big, by quite a bit. And then for new players coming in, it's actually expecting them to have a lower win rate than they end up having. Trueskill 2 does a much better job of tracking win rates. However, it is consistently underestimating the win rate. This is because many of the players considered new in our test set are not actually new players. Oh, it's smurfing. Never mind. Individual statistics. In the Halo 5 data, each match results list statistics for each player, such as the number of kills they scored and the number of times they were killed, deaths. Since these numbers are likely to be correlated with skill, it's worth trying to include this data in the model. So now we're getting into including individual statistics, which again is a big part of what differentiates Trueskill 2 from the previous Trueskill 1 model, is the individual statistics. So for example, in League, you might compare the statistics that somebody generates on a certain champion to, as many people pointed out, the average of how somebody does on that champion. But if you can exploit those statistics, then that would be worrisome. But of course, you're probably not going to be able to do that because wins are more important than anything else. Wins and losses are going to be a bigger parameter than anything else. So even if you exploited having a better KDA than other people who play Braum, let's say you played a champion that notoriously has a low KDA, like a top laner who doesn't, participate or interact with the rest of their team very much, and you pick that champion and you get a much better KDA by making sure that you're playing safe and not dying very much, which is the biggest influence on KDA, and making sure that you manage to get around to the rest of your team during the later part of the game and team fights to actually group enough to get more assists than the rest of people playing top lane on that champion. Now, if you exploited something like that in order to try to get a higher rating, what would happen is that you would again eventually just match against players that are much higher than you, or a little bit, even just a little bit higher than you, and you would get killed more often not be able to maintain such a high KDA, and you would lose more games than you win, and this would negate the effect, and you would go back to the proper rank that you should be. Because at the end of the day, like we saw with one of those graphs, the systems, elo system or the Trueskill system, both do a good job of placing your long-term rank at a place where you're going to win 50% of your games. They're both quite accurate at that. Then it's a question of, okay, I'm slowly, gradually improving. At the end of the day, what you have to do is recognize that whatever system they're using, it is a competitive game. They are using a skill-based matchmaking system, and you're going to have to improve your skill at the game in order to get better at the game. Now, this being said, let's take a look at how they're using kills and deaths here. If you improve how good you are at the game, it will improve the rank that you're able to win 50% of your games at, and that will be reflected eventually over, when you play lots of games of League, no matter what, whether they use this stuff or not. In Halo 5 data, each match result lists statistics for each player, such as the number of kills they scored and the number of times they were killed, deaths. We read this part. As with any model change, the first step is to define metrics that demonstrate the usefulness of this data for estimating skill ratings. One approach is to partition players according to the number of kills they score per minute of play, their kill rate, and look for discrepancies between their actual and predicted win rate. In doing so, it's important to exclude the number of kills in the match whose outcome is being predicted, because there's an obvious correlation between scoring many kills in a match and winning that match. The table below partitions players in the test set according to their kill rate in their previous match. There are significant differences between their actual and expected win rate under the classic Trueskill model. So here we're seeing that their kill rate in the previous game, the higher it is, the better their win rate becomes, even though Trueskill expects that there would be not much of a difference. Could be because they're smurfing, could be because they're just like significantly better than the rank that they're playing at right now, or whatever, than their previous Trueskill rating would suggest, their Trueskill 1 rating, and so they have to adjust again. The remaining task is to choose an appropriate probabilistic generative model for player kill and death counts. A common model for sports scores is a Poisson distribution whose mean depends on a team's scoring ability minus their opponent's defensive ability. Bio and Blangiardo 2010, etc. This assumes that scoring events occur with a constant rate and independently of the time since the last event. This implies that scores should scale with the length of the match, yet none of the cited papers include this effect in their model. To test this theory, we partitioned matches by length, computed the average number of kills and deaths per player, and the variance around this average. To estimate variations due to skill, we only considered matches where all players had a near average skill rating. To eliminate variations due to game mode, we only considered matches in Warzone mode. Here are the results. So we can see here that as the match length goes on in minutes, the kill average and the death average go up, and the variance also is going up, and it's going up more than the average. The plot shows that both the mean and the variance of the count scale linearly with match length, as would be expected by the independence assumption. However, the variance does not equal the mean, as required by a Poisson distribution. Therefore, we chose to use a truncated Gaussian distribution for the counts. Another key aspect of these papers is that they use latent variables whose sole purpose is to model the scoring ability of a team. In Trueskill 2, the goal is to correlate kill/death counts with existing player skill variable. In game modes where the objective is to score the most kills, then we expect this correlation to be high. In game modes where the objective is to capture territory or simply stay alive as long as possible, we expect this correlation to be low. Even in modes where the objective is to score kills, there may be teamwork effects where players can help their team win without scoring kills themselves. We ultimately want player skill to reflect the player's ability to win, not their ability to score kills. So this is really important, and we talked about this a lot before with League, is that League and player skill in League is not about your ability to kill the opponent. In fact, a lot of times, like we talked about, playing the game kind of passively is a really good way to play the game if your sole purpose is to try to win that individual match, not necessarily to climb. If you're lower rated and you need to learn the game, you should fight a lot in order to learn the game and improve. But obviously, the game is quite passive if you're trying to play it properly. And then on top of that, for if you want skill to represent the player's ability to destroy the Nexus, that has so many different things related to it. It could come down to a player's ability to secure dragons, a player's ability to secure Rift Heralds, a player's ability to split push and take towers, a player's ability to team fight and kill the enemy team together with their team in order to take towers at certain times, right? Like, just getting kills on its own without considering anything is probably indicative of a player's skill, but it's not the only thing that matters. And what should be the primary variable or the primary focus is actually winning the game. And it's very important that it stays that way, especially in a game like League, because you will disincentivize people to play to win the game. And so if you play for kills when you should actually be like playing passive because you don't know where the enemy jungler is, or you play for kills when you should be waiting for your teammates to reset, or it's not time for an objective, or your teammate's not on a power spike. Like, these things that you do that aren't working around your teammates that could hinder your ability to win but might result in you potentially getting a kill. Like, those things are not good to incentivize, like really bad to incentivize. So it's one of the reasons why I was most worried about Trueskill 2 is potentially incentivizing people to do the wrong thing. And then the lack of transparency about having such a complicated rank system instead of just using something that's, yes, a little bit more inefficient, but look at how complicated this is compared to the ELO system. So why not just use a simple thing? This paper in and of itself, right, describes that essentially you should use the simplest model available to you, for your app that's good enough for your application. And I think that the ELO system is good enough for competitive games and even for team games. And, I think that that's totally fine. And I think that there's certain value, and they didn't get into that in this paper, but there's definitely certain value of having a system that people understand, as well as a system that that it is a little bit more accurate, right? Let's see, where were we? Our solution to this problem is to predict individual statistics from the performance variables performance, as explained in section 2. The performance variables determine the winner of the match. Therefore, the model cannot choose skill ratings that only predict individual statistics. They must predict the match winner first and secondarily predict the individual statistics. Good. We expect that the most benefit from including individual statistics will come in team games. In such games, the players on a team can have different performance values as long as their total performance is consistent with the match result. Trueskill 2 uses this flexibility to give more credit for a win to players with the best individual scores, something that classic Trueskill cannot do. So this is something that I think like a lot of people were actually happy about. And I don't know how to feel about this, right? It's like the idea that if you played well in a loss, you won't be penalized as much in your skill rating. And so it'll be easier for you to climb in the future, regardless of that unlucky game. But on the other hand, if you play poorly according to their metrics and you manage to win the game, you'll be penalized for playing poorly, even if you won. And potentially, if they didn't set up the metrics properly, you could be penalized for playing to win and your play resulting in you winning. That's really tough, right? Like, for example, and this is something that's really important. Yes, they're going to use the win data and the loss data, like I said, and so that's always going to be their primary method. Yes, in the long run, it's going to be fine either way. But one thing to keep in mind is that all deaths in League are not created equal. I talk a lot about how when you're reflecting on your mistakes, how do you define how bad a mistake is in League? when a lot of people are confronted with how do I define how bad a mistake is in League, they measure kind of how bad the mistake was based on how abnormal it is for them to do something like that. Like, normally I don't play that bad. This was like, I knew this was really bad and I did something really crazy here. They basically measure it by like, like they would consider like a really bad mistake, like failing flash, because it's something that you should be capable of doing. And it's like so abnormal to mess it up that it's like really bad when it happens, right? Feels really bad. But actually, you might have a mistake that is like way smaller of a egregious mistake. Like, it's not this egregious thing that should have never happened. It's just like you make a small error, but you should actually think about mistakes in League in terms of the outcome or the result of the mistake that you made. So if you like take a fight that looks like you're going to win, and then somebody you didn't expect comes out of Fog of War and kills you right before Baron, and then their team gets Baron, that mistake is way more egregious than you like failing flash one time, because that mistake cost you way more. And so you should think about mistakes in League in terms of basically their impact on losing you or winning you the game, right? Like, how much closer did this play get us to losing the game than if I hadn't have done this? And if you lost the game off of that one death is a lot more meaningful than one death in lane or something like that you came back from. That like, only cost you 300 gold as opposed to a Baron. And so you have to keep in mind, right, that like if you're using deaths or kills and that sort of thing as a secondary metric, the player who killed that like game-winning kill that got them Baron, and the person who assisted in setting up that play that got them the game-winning kill that got them Baron, that play and those assists and kills are more valuable. And that death was more painful or more valuable or whatever you want to call it, more impactful than the other ones. And so not all deaths are treated equally in League. The issue here is that we don't know. They will never say what metrics they're using specifically when they implement this in League, because if they tell us, players will play for those incentives, and that would ruin the system in and of itself. So they can't ever tell us. But if they don't ever tell us, then we can't ever fact check or like theorize about like, okay, is Riot actually implementing this properly? Because we'll never know what the metrics are. So we can't say whether they're using improper metrics or whether the way that they're using the metrics is good or not. Obviously, they're going to test it. They're going to make sure that the data is telling them that like they're, if there was something really wrong and it was putting players way higher than they should be, they'd see that happening, that like, oh, this player got put way too high and now they're like, losing. But or they see that this player was put too low and now they're winning like crazy. And again, in the long run, both systems get to the same place. But certainly you would want to make sure that that's not... You'd certainly want to make sure that the system in place is totally appropriate and not causing those problems, even if it's just for the short run, because it would still be a problem in the short run. We expect that the most benefit from including individual statistics will come in team games, blah, blah, blah. We'll give more credit for a win to players with the best individual scores, something that classic Trueskill cannot do. To determine how the individual statistics depend on performance, we partition players by skill, the average skill of their teammates and the average skill of their opponents. We found that the statistics were linear in all three, with teammates having a very small effect. Therefore, to keep the model simple, we dropped the dependence on teammates. Putting all of the above together gives the following model for a count of type C, blah, 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 a bunch of math, where blah, blah, blah are tunable parameters for each count type in each game mode. These parameters determine the correlation between individual statistic and skill rating. For two teams of equal size where everyone played for the full time, performance is the average performance of the opposing team. Typically, blah, 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 have different signs. For kill count, WP greater than 0 and O or W0 is less than 0. For death count, blah, blah, blah. If the player's team is larger than the opposing team, then we need a different formula to account for the divided attention of each opposing player. For each player I, let blah, 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 blah. Okay, so they've come up with this formula. This formula works for any number of team sizes, for any number of teams of any sizes. Thus, there are three key differences between Trueskill 2's model of individual statistics and previous work on sports scores. Trueskill 2 incorporates the effect of match length. Trueskill 2 models the correlation between individual statistics and a player's ability to win. Trueskill 2 incorporates the effect of having many different teams of different sizes. The linear model here could be replaced with a more flexible model if the data warranted it. However, it is important that the model is constrained to be monotonic. A monotonic relationship incentivizes players to maximize their kill count and minimize their death count. A non-monotonic relationship would give the players misaligned incentives, such as stopping when they reach a certain number of kills. The table below shows the effect of these model changes on the test set. So now the win rate, based on the player's previous kill rate in the previous game, is more accurately predicted by Trueskill 2 by using their previous kill and death metrics. There is a much better agreement between the actual and expected win rate. Therefore, the skill estimate from their individual statistics are more accurate. So this, in practice in League, would get people back to the rank that they deserve to play at faster at a Smurf, or as a new player who's really, really good or something like that. And it would also match fairer matches by more quickly and more accurately using other data like kills and deaths in order to figure out what rank a player probably is likely to be, and then match based on that. And then if win and loss data for whatever reason happen to differ with that, because the win and loss data is the primary source of determining a player's skill, that is going to have a bigger impact. And of course, once you get 100, 200 games played, you're going to have such a large amount of win and loss data that the player's individual statistics that it's using to consider this are going to be relatively negligible. Set 9, or Part 9, Quit Penalty. As discussed in Section 2, Classic Trueskill does not penalize players who quit. Trueskill 2 solves this problem by including a player's completion status, completed versus quit, in the generative model. The first step, as always, is to define the metrics that measure the relationship between the completion status and skill. In Section 8, we looked at players' behavior in the previous match. The same approach works here. Specifically, we can partition players according to their completion status in the previous match and look for discrepancies between their actual and predicted win rate. So we see here that if they completed their win, if they quit a game that they ended up winning, or if they completed a loss, or if they quit a loss, and then we have draws here, which don't really matter that much. And basically what we can see is that a player who quit was much more likely to lose, and a player that won but despite quitting was also much more likely to lose. And so they were basically able to use this to adjust that, like, people who are rage quitting games are essentially like not very capable of holding their own at that rank or contributing to their team in a meaningful way that you would expect a normal player at that rank to. And so Trueskill is overestimating their team's chance of winning because of the fact that that it's not taking this metric into account. So this table shows that quitters tend to have lower skill for the same match outcome, but their true skill rating does not reflect this. Digging deeper into the data, we found that players who quit have worse individual statistics than players who complete, even for the same amount of time played. This suggests that players quit more when their performance is low, but low relative to what? According to Section 8, individual statistics are determined by the player's performance minus the opposing team's performance. This suggests that the following probabilistic model for whether a player is underperforming has to do with their performance versus like the performance of the other team, where performance is defined the same way as in Section 8, and M and V are tunable parameters per game mode that allow for variation in the degree that a player underperforms. We force MQ to be less than or equal to 0 during parameter estimation. Of course, a player may not quit when they underperform, and players may quit for other reasons. We model these effects by random Boolean variables. Quit equals unrelated or related and under. Where unrelated is true with probability PU and related I is true with probability PR, both tunable parameters in each game mode. The net effect of this model is that it will infer lower performance values for players who quit compared to players who do not quit. A surprising side effect is that in order to penalize players that quit, the model must reward players that complete. It is counterintuitive for a player's skill rating to increase simply for completing a match, especially if they played for 0 seconds. But in order to penalize players that quit with 0 seconds played, the model must reward players that complete with 0 seconds played. Note that this model also adds a small amount of additional computation to process each match, even if no player quits. A property that we would like is that if no player quits, then the computational cost and final result should be identical to classic Trueskill. This means we cannot use a model that generates completion status. Instead, we treat a quit as an additional observation that only appears when a player quits. We interpret a quit as the outcome of a mini-game between the player and a reskill version of the enemy team. Unfortunately, since this model is unnormalized, we cannot easily learn its parameters. Our solution is to learn parameters using the normalized model, then switch to the unnormalized model for online updating. With the same parameters in experiments, this switch actually gives a slight improvement in predictive accuracy compared to using the normalized model throughout. The table below shows the effect of these model changes on the same test as above. So the win rate, right, and obviously like before with all of the other improvements that they've made, Trueskill is essentially more accurate at predicting the win rate. We see that Trueskill 2 lowers a player's skill rating after a quit, but a bit more than it should. Features that did not need to be added. But this is also fine because it's good to punish players for quitting. You do want to disincentivize quitting. So in the same way you wouldn't want to incentivize people to play for kills, disincentivizing people to play for AFKing or to AFK is probably just a good thing, even if it's a little bit inaccurate. Features that did not need to be added. The model changes so far have all had orthogonal metrics. That is, metrics that motivated each change could not be fixed by the other changes. For example, the metrics that motivated squad offsets are not fixed by modeling individual statistics or experience. But in other cases, metrics that seem to indicate a model change are automatically fixed by earlier changes. For example, when we partition players according to the length of time since their last match lapse, we get the following table. Win rate decreases with the amount of days lapsed since playing the game, and classic Trueskill does not capture this. This seems to indicate that a player lapse should be added to the model. However, once the experience effect was added in Trueskill 2, the correct trend with lapse emerged automatically. This looks undershot a little bit. They should have added it maybe anyways. A related occurrence was features that seemed like they should be useful to add to the model but turned out to be unnecessary. So they actually didn't end up adding the lapse in days since when you last played because the expected Trueskill 2 after making all these changes was so accurate anyways at predicting people even if they had a lapse in playing that they didn't feel like they needed to add it. I would argue that they could have fine-tuned these things, but you know, it's fine. Blah, blah, blah. So these things were caught early by looking at the right metrics. For example, player scores seem like it should be relevant since it incorporates mode-specific objectives. The raw score reported by the game includes kills, so we subtracted these off to get a number we call extra score. As in section 8, we partitioned players by their extra score in the previous match and compared their actual and expected win rate with kills and deaths already included in the model. These numbers matched, so player score did not need to be added. Mode correlation. Most online multiplayer games have multiple game modes, which change the rules and or objectives of the game. A player typically queues up to play a particular mode and expects the matchmaker to construct a fair match for that mode. Thus, the matchmaker needs to know a player's skill rating in a particular mode. In some games, such as Halo 5, a mode is chosen after matchmaking. Even in these cases, it can be useful to have a skill rating per mode, since it leads to a faster convergence and a more accurate skill rating overall. For example, suppose player A has high skill in mode 1 and low skill in mode 2. When playing against a mid-level opponent, we expect A to win in mode 1 and lose in mode 2. So if A wins in mode 1, then the opponent's skill rating should decrease slightly, if at all. But if A wins in mode 2, then the opponent's skill rating should decrease significantly. To construct a single skill rating for matchmaking, take a weighted average of the player's rating in each mode, where the weight is the probability of playing that mode. The traditional approach to handling multiple gameplay modes in Trueskill is to have a separate skill distribution for each mode. This is equivalent to assuming that a person's skill in one mode is independent of their skill in another mode. We can easily test this assumption by comparing the skill ratings computed by Trueskill for different gameplay modes. For two of the modes in the Halo 5 data, we plot the skill ratings of players with many games played in both modes. So we can obviously see that there's like some correlation here. The skill ratings are correlated with a correlation coefficient of 0.6. Repeating this experiment for all pairs of gameplay modes gives similar results. A player's skill in any gameplay mode is positively correlated with their skill in all other modes. This makes sense since many of the game's mechanics, such as the controls, are the same between modes. This suggests that we can improve skill estimation by borrowing information from other gameplay modes. Since the prior distribution 1 on a player's skill is Gaussian, a natural way to correlate skills is to use a multivariate Gaussian distribution with a full covariance matrix between modes. However, estimating the correlation between all pairs of modes requires a significant amount of training data. Let me just say one thing on this. I really think that they need to be using, and we already know that they use normal game MMR to impact new ranked placement. I really think it would potentially be a good idea to both continue to use normal game MMR to impact ranked, because I know a lot of people who are ranked, but they play a lot of normal games primarily still. I know it's a weird group, but there are people who do it. And I think that if their rating were to go up, a little bit quicker as a reflection of them doing well in normal games, that would probably be a good thing, because it would, if they could do it accurately, like any of these other changes, if they do it accurately, it would just mean that they get to a more appropriate rank more quickly, which is always a good thing. And it seems to be what Riot is trying to do. On the other side, there are a lot of players who are like casual players who are complaining that a lot of people are playing normal games who have played ranked and are now very high MMR in ranked and very good players who've been playing ranked primarily for years. And when they come back to play normal games, their MMR in normal games is way lower than their MMR in ranked. And so they get unfair matchmaking in normal games where they're like thrown into these much lower MMR games and then stomp, especially if they're trying or they're on their main champion or something like that. And that's something I've experienced because I troll a lot, like not like int, but I do some experimentation and play for fun in normal games a lot of the time. And as a result, plus given that most of the normal games I played were a long time ago when I wasn't playing ranked and when I was a lot lower rank, my normal game MMR is quite low. And so as a result, when I go into a normal game, if I were to ever pick Braum, I would have like almost 100% chance of winning the game, and that's not fun or fair for anybody. Now, luckily, when I do go into normal games, I tend to like practice other random stuff or like play something for fun or play another role or try a random build or something like that, like most people do in normals. But if they could just use my ranked MMR and transfer that to my normal MMR for matchmaking purposes, then if they did that, we would have less problems with these newer casual players complaining about normal MMR games not being like properly balanced or match made. So I think it's good. And I think actually the biggest implication or implementation for this at this point would be making sure that ranked affects your normal game matchmaking. One difficulty of intertwining them like this, though, is that, as I said, if you go into normal games and beat up on new players and try super hard, like if I want to play a normal game with my friend on my main, I wouldn't want that to affect my ranked. And I wouldn't want to feel like I have to go into a normal game and try hard on Braum, on my main champion, because it's going to affect my rank. So that's a really nasty implication, that like you can't go play this game mode just for fun, or with your friends, and not have to worry about it affecting your rank, because people don't want to have to go try hard in normal games in order to help their rank or something like that. However, estimating the correlation between all pairs of modes requires a significant amount of training data. Typically, a game has a fewer popular modes and a long tail of short-lived or niche modes. Therefore, in order to keep training data requirements low, we opted for a simpler approach where skills are correlated along a single dimension, which we call the player's base skill. The base skill evolves over time, and the base skill for player I at time t is denoted by base IT. The skill of a player I in mode D at T time is denoted by skill and is equal to the base skill plus an offset. The generative process for skills is changed to the following. The base skill is drawn from a Gaussian prior distribution. We're not going to go through all this math. Let's see, where do we pick up again? Where TO is the time of the first game and VB is a tunable parameter. The base skill changes with each match played, as well as between matches. The offset for a mode is drawn from a Gaussian prior distribution. Where M and V are tunable parameters, the offset changes with each match played, as well as between matches. Finally, skill is the weighted sum of base and offset. Where WD is a tunable parameter that governs the correlation between modes. If WD is 0, mode D has no correlation with any other mode. To avoid bad local optima, we force WD to be greater than or equal to 0 during parameter estimation. The online updating algorithm from section 3 changes in the following way. Instead of maintaining a skill distribution per game mode, we maintain one base skill distribution plus an offset distribution per game mode. When processing a match result, we first increase the variance of the base distribution and offset distribution for the game mode. Since these distributions are all Gaussian, the distribution over skill defined by 20 is also Gaussian. The skill distribution is updated by the per match model, which can be interpreted as a message from the match result to the skill variable. This message propagates to the base and offset variables in the usual manner of expectation propagation to determine their posterior distributions. In practice, all we have to do is add 20 to the model description for infer.net and regenerate the skill updating code, which will output the posterior distribution for base and offset directly. During matchmaking, when we want a player's skill rating in a particular mode, we look up the base skill distribution and offset a player's skill rating in a particular mode. We look up the base skill distribution and offset skill distribution if it exists, then apply 20. The net effect is that when a player's skill is updated in one mode, it will also be updated in other modes. However, the mathematics of the update ensures that these changes will be negligible once the player has played a sufficient number of matches in the other mode. A player's skill rating in a mode where many matches have already been played will not be affected by playing other modes. Okay, they mention League here for the first time. In some games, such as League of Legends and Dota 2, players can play as different characters with different abilities. Using the same mechanism as above, a player could be given a different skill rating with each character, and these can be correlated even if players choose their character after matchmaking. Maintaining separate skill ratings increases the convergence rate and overall accuracy of the skill rating system. For the same reason as given earlier for game modes, if you beat someone who is playing a character for the first time, you should not get the same rating change as beating their best character. To construct a single skill rating for matchmaking, a simple approach is to take a weighted average of the player's skill rating with each character, where the weight is their probability of choosing that character. So this is also really big because first off, they specifically mention League here, and they mentioned that you could have a post-champion select accurate skill-based rating system based on a player having a different skill rating on each champion. So I did mention earlier that when, if you were to get rid of smurfing, it would be really nice if you could have a different skill rating for each role, but I thought it would be impossible to implement a different skill rating for each champion, or at least very complicated, because of the fact that you pick your champion after champion select. However, according to this paper, it sounds like it's not that big of a deal, and they'd be able to implement that, which I think would be really cool because it makes it easier to ban smurfing because people could have an individual rating for each champion, which would mean that they would be fine doing that. You could also, they said one of the purposes of matchmaking rating is to provide interest in, like an interesting competition or interest in the competition, to be able to compare players and stuff like that, to be able to see that a player, for example, I could prove by playing more Leona and Nautilus and other things that although I play most of my games on Braum, I'm actually quite the competent player at several different champions, as like my big chart or whatever shows, because I have a lot of experience on other champions. I just happen to be basically one-tricking Braum to try to get to Challenger right now. And so I think it would be awesome if I could have a different skill rating for 10 different support champions and show that even if I'm playing most of my games on Braum, if I have time to develop a skill rating on those other champions, I can show and prove without it affecting my skill rating on Braum, or my highest skill rating that gives me my rank. I'd be able to prove that I'm good at a certain set of characters, and more able to then like compete to get on teams and stuff like that too, which is also one of the core functions of the matchmaking system was, like, let's say qualifying for tournaments, which let's say in League would be more like trying to qualify to get a tryout or trying to get onto a team. So yeah, this is really interesting. And I also wonder, since Riot said that they're implementing Trueskill 2 by the end of the year, which is the whole point of this, is this, which specifically mentions League of Legends, the only thing that does in either of these papers, is a rating system for each champion coming to League? Is this something, since this is the one thing in the paper that's specifically targeted at a game like League, and League is going to be working with Microsoft to implement this by the end of the year, I have to say my bet is that within the next year or two, we're going to see some form of champion by champion rating system implemented. And if they already can do something like that, and so people can feel comfortable playing whatever champion they want to, even if it's in another role on their main account, then go ahead and ban smurfing, because there's not a good reason to have another smurf account then if you can do this with certain champions. So anyways, okay, Gears of War 4. Trueskill 2 has been successfully, so now they're going to get into their tests, has been used successfully as a skill rating system in Gears of War 4 since its launch in 2016. Skills are updated in real time using the online updates. Before each new season of ranked play, all skills and model parameters are recomputed using batch interference. Or not batch interference, batch inference. Trueskill through time on the data from all previous seasons. Unlike Halo 5, Gears of War 4 has AI controlled bots in social and co-op game modes. Each bot has a difficulty level. We include bots into the skill rating system by treating each difficulty level as a unique player. However, while human skills are assumed to change over time, a bot's skill is assumed constant over time. This means that the updates 8 and 3 are not applied to bot skills. A bot's skill rating may change as we learn about the bot, but eventually this will converge. Thus, bots provide a fixed baseline against which all human skills can be measured. The inference skill ratings for the bots can also provide feedback to the game designers about the true difficulty level of each bot. That's really interesting, actually, because if they made like some AI, like bots, you might actually be able to use this to, even take League, for example. You know how we were talking about they're trying to force people to play like 10 normal games, so that on a new account before they can play ranked, so that players, they have some data, those 10 games from the players, to use to place them in ranked, right? To help with the normal game MMR affecting ranked placement. Imagine if for accounts that were leveled all in bot games, they could use this system to actually determine the skill level of the bots at, let's say, beginner and intermediate levels, and then they could use that skill rating and how players do versus the skill rating in order to help place players into ranked, even if they were just playing bot games. That could be really interesting as well. Okay, 13 summary. This paper has presented Trueskill 2, a collection of model changes to Trueskill, as well as a new system for estimating model parameters. Trueskill 2 gives significantly more accurate skill ratings than Trueskill, measured along a variety of axes important to a game studio. Acknowledgements and references. Okay, so that's Trueskill 2, which is coming to League in some form. Obviously, Riot is a big game studio that does actually have people working on ranked constantly. And so, they are going to work with Microsoft to individualize this a little bit for League for sure, especially before they full on implement it. They may be testing parts of it now. It may already be implemented, but they did say that their goal was to implement Trueskill 2 by the end of season 14. This means that certain metrics in here that are in the paper, which I'll leave in the description, the links to both papers, but definitely for Trueskill 2, certain things like kills, deaths, if you're duoing with a premade or not, these things are going to affect your MMR gains and MMR losses and how you're doing in ranked. But in the long run, really all this is going to do is place players at their appropriate rank a little bit more quickly. And in the long run, whether it's ELO or the Trueskill 2 system, like we saw in, I think it was, let's see this graph over here. Was it in this first one? Yeah, like we saw in this one, the long-term result, was it here? Maybe it was in this one. But either way, the long-run result is that you're going to end up with the same rating, whether you're using Trueskill 2 or Trueskill 1 or the ELO system or whatever. You're going to end up with the same rating over 200 games played or so. Yeah, it's like this one. So here we can see like the dotted lines, if we remember, were the ELO system, which starts at the same place and then gradually and slowly climbs to the appropriate rank. Here's the Trueskill system, which kind of like wildly overestimates or underestimates a player, but then quickly adjusts by throwing them into a lot of like very high variance matches that are like way above or way below where they should be at in order to get a really quick idea of where they should be. But then it kind of flattens out, and the player would need to make some individual improvements to see any kind of climb. Yeah, so I have mixed feelings about it. Like I said, I think in the long run, you're going to get the same thing. So player 1 is in black and player 2 is in this dark gray. So we can see here that they converge about here and then kind of flatline as this player's skill level emerges. And then this player stopped before they converged because they only played like 110 games. But you can see that they were working on converging to each other, etc. Basically, I have mixed feelings. On the one hand, it's maybe a little bit more efficient, as we can see, at like bringing a player more quickly. So like if this player's appropriate skill level is like here, it's getting there in like a little over 50 games. If this player's appropriate skill level is like, here, it's getting there in like literally like 10 games. This says that on average, it was looking like about 10 games to get a good convergence on their appropriate rank. If that's the case, right, only about 10 games, that's a lot more efficient than the number of games, I would say, from my experience and from what this chart shows, which is that you need about 200 games played in order for ELO to accurately predict your rating or to converge on your 50% win rate rank. And in some ways, that is better, right, that it's able to get there so much quicker, and it's going to be the same in the long run. But on the other hand, if you're a new player, would you rather come in, be thrown into these high variance games and then decline, or would you rather have a slow, steady climb upward? Keep in mind, though, that these were two of the best players in Halo. If you were a bad player, we would see the opposite of this happening. So if you were a bad player and you were like an iron player or a new player coming into the game, most new players would actually experience a slow decline in ELO, which would be very painful and cause a lot of people to quit, as opposed to a quick adjustment and then a flat line at their appropriate rank. So I think when you take it at its base, I think that Trueskill has the potential to cause people to play for the wrong incentives. But it really shouldn't, because you're going to end up at the same rating either way, which is where you're skilled enough to win 50% of your games over a large sample size of games, which is like 100, 200 games. Less with Trueskill. I think that Trueskill is good in the sense that it gets people to their appropriate rating faster, especially if you still allow Smurfs in the game, and especially so the new player's experience is less getting crushed over and over again over time and falling all the way down to Iron 4, and more of a consistent 50-50 once they get through their first 10 placement games or so. So hope you guys learned something about the rank system and about the new Trueskill system that's going to be coming to League. Good luck in solo queue, and have a wonderful day.